Okay, this is an episode of a series I'm calling Thorinquiry, which doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue, but I'm going with it anyway. I'm just going to see if I can make it work. And my guest for this one is Sargon of Akkad, who is a well-known thinker, debater. I mean, there's a lot of other things people would call you, as people will know if they've been to your channel or seen anything about you, but we'll just leave it at that. I think that's a nice way to set it up. And so there's a lot of different ways. If people have seen your channel, all the different topics you've discussed and the different people you've discussed, there's a lot of different areas we can go with here. So the place I want to start, though, is you mentioned from time to time on your video the reason why you picked the name Sargon of Akkad and the reason why this is someone who maybe you were interested in, or you thought was, I mean, you described him as an epic individual. You know, I don't necessarily know that you would aspire to be him, but you know, this is an interesting choice. But I wanted to know, one thing that I'm always fascinated by is when people pick a certain name and then they have a certain persona, certain qualities they want associated with their name. It's one thing in the very, very simplistic element of the gaming world that I come from, where you might just have picked a name because you have to pick a name and then you play when you're 15 or something and then it sticks. That's not really like as conscious a choice of like why you're picking the name, you know. But it seems like there is an element to which the name you've picked and the way you've crafted your persona to some degree, I mean, there's some conscious components to it, right? So what do you think of when you think of the persona of Sargon?
It's actually exactly as you described with gaming. I had used this pseudonym for a long time before I ever made a YouTube video, when I was playing video games with friends. So he was just my favorite historical figure. I think I'm probably enamored with his life because we know so little about it, and it's such a long time back in history. And I just love all the sort of Middle Eastern ancient sort of imagery and the art styles they had. And so it's just a favorite time period of mine. And he's just one of my favorite stories. And it was just on forums and message boards. I mean, I'd registered my YouTube account like 3 years before I ever made a video. So, and I didn't give any thought to like branding or anything like that. I am terrible at marketing myself. I'm absolutely awful. So I should have thought about it harder, to be honest.
Okay. Well, in that case, maybe I can turn it to this direction then. I have also noticed another thing, which is that sometimes when you pick a name or weave elements initially into your persona, you don't know kind of where they're going to go, especially if you don't know, what you're going to do with that persona, how many years you might be involved with it. And so I know oftentimes people find like weird things that match up that maybe they didn't think about when they first launched that element to it. So I often say this, looking back now, I couldn't have done this obviously when I first started with my alias, but if people ever ask me for advice in this regard, one thing I've kind of looked at over my own career where I've tried to refine how my persona comes across is the notion that, okay, you can't really control every element because some of it's, your actual personality leaking through. Other part is, how you choose to present yourself. But one thing I do say is I think a good approach can be to think of like a few qualities that you want to define what you do. And then in general, that way, as you're deciding how to present yourself, what to do, you can at least, some of that could guide it, like you could think, well, is that in line with who I'm trying to present myself as, So could you give us like a few qualities that would align in this respect for you?
I hate to disappoint again, but I really don't think of anything like that when I'm making a video. Now I'm feeling self-conscious because I'm thinking, Christ, I don't know. I just don't put any thought into my presentation, which is why my videos look so cheap and badly produced. I just don't think about it. I guess like as things have gone along over the years, though, I've picked up like signatures, like the cigar and the sword, because I went on a holiday to Andorra for a friend's stag do, and I picked up some lovely Cuban cigars, and I took a photo of myself smoking a cigar on top of a mountain, and I had that as my profile picture for a while. And so people started, whenever they do like, I don't know, fan art or something like that, they'd start incorporating the cigar between my fingers. And then, like, I think it was after that, I'd gone away for a weekend to do a traditional bronze making, making of a bronze sword. There's a weekend away in Wales. It was an Irish sword as well, so it wasn't even, an applicable sword for the time period that Sargon would have lived in. But he might have had something kind of similar, just a lot less well produced. But that it just happens to fit the image with this like leaf-shaped bronze sword. It's probably not that anachronistic. It's not a katana or anything, and it just kind of, I guess it just kind of it fit. I mean, that's what everyone puts in the artwork these days, and that's fine because it looks cool. So I don't mind, you know. But I just, it's all just kind of grown homogenous, like naturally. I haven't put any effort into it, although I should, I'm sure.
So the one thing that I actually find a little bit problematic in a lot of debates that you see, even when they're people who you don't necessarily antagonistically disagree, is that they don't really do that great a job often at the beginning of defining kind of like who they are, what their stance is. They just launch into their very advanced, sophisticated arguments as though you didn't need to have a shared dictionary, etc. So actually I thought, and let's see if you want to go along with this, I thought what we could do at the beginning is I could ask you a couple of simple questions, which are kind of thought experiments that you'll have heard of before.
Sure.
And I just wanted to see what you would say to this, because I know some people would assume, with the tone that you take in some of your videos, that you think of yourself as a moralist or some sort of...
Sometimes.
I won't say ethical paragon, because that's a bit pretentious for anyone, you know, but certainly someone with strong ethics, right?
Yeah, I try to make sure I'm operating within my own ethical bounds, for example, if I've made a mistake, I'll be... I keep track of the comments, and if someone gives me a correction, I'll put the correction on the video as soon as I can. Obviously I don't take corporate money because, and the thing is not that I even think it's necessarily unethical to take corporate money. I just don't. It starts putting incentives and influences over you that I just don't really want to have over me, because I don't really like them. I find them a bit grubby. Not that they're morally wrong. Or even unethical or anything like that. I would just prefer not to, you know.
Okay, so these are some very famous ones, okay? And it's going to be a couple of branches of the very famous Trolley experiment.
Oh, God.
And so I just wanted to see what you'd say to this, because here's the thing. I actually think a lot of people, even intellectuals, unless they were in what they thought was a very safe intellectual environment, might not answer these questions truthfully, because they might think that it could be taken out of context, or someone could... Well, luckily, I know in your case, to some degree, you don't have to fear that, because that's already happening of everything you say, and so they've done their worst. So let's start with the very simple, famous one, which is the idea that there's these two tracks, and there's a lever, and you're in control of the lever, and if this train goes down the normal track that it's on at the moment, it kills, let's say, 5 people. I forget the usual premise, but it kills 5. It's multiple people. And the idea, the very famous one, is that if you pull the lever, so you take this action, it'll divert the trolley, and it goes down the other track where it only kills 1 person. And the idea is these are nondescript people. We don't know who they are. Funnily enough, they often put that weird flower dressing in, that one of them's a fat man or something. I don't know why that part has to be in it, but okay. I remember that is a famous element, the idea, which I always thought, just don't add that in, you know. It's going to make people think. So this is a very simple one, and people can probably guess what you're supposed to say if you're an ethical person. Would you pull the lever if it saves the multiple people and it kills the 1 person?
See, it's a really, really tough moral question, isn't it?
It is,
because this is something I have thought quite a lot about. Because is it unethical to do nothing if you know that your action is going to result in the death of someone else, even if it's you averting the deaths of other people? Because, I mean, and I'm presuming that I didn't set the cart into motion or put the people on the tracks.
Yes. For whatever reason, you're in a bizarre scenario you'd never been in.
Yeah, you've just walked, around a corner and this is happening and you have to react. Because I don't think anyone would say that you're morally culpable for allowing multiple people to die if you do nothing in a situation like that. I mean, who's going to point the finger and say you should have? You could have all sorts of reasons for not doing it. Shock could be one of them, and the other person just, who knows what, So I don't know whether someone's morally culpable for not doing it. And as soon as you take an action here, I think you do become morally culpable for what you are doing. So, I mean, if it was, say, Albert Einstein versus 5 janitors, I would be like, okay, I don't want to put value on human life, but if I'm suddenly forced to make a decision, and it could be the wrong one, I could completely make a wrong decision. But I think the standard ethical, the standard answer in this situation is you just do the mathematics on it. And so I probably would as well.
Okay. So yeah, as you kind of unpacked it there's also different ways to see it. Like, for example, it really would have to be nondescript people. If you had any clue who they were already, people would start to at least think about it differently. And that's obviously one of the things with this experiment. Anyone who thinks, well, that's obvious, you're supposed to do that, well, that's really the whole point of the experiment. If there was an easy answer. So the other famous one, okay, is where you just slightly twist the premise, and it's the same exact question, but with a different implication, which is the one where now there's a train running along, and there's only one track, and the train or trolley or whatever is going to crash over the multiple people, but you're on a bridge over the top of the train line. And in this one, I guess I understand why there might be a fat person in this one, right? It's a fat man on there.
I know.
And the notion for this one, the very famous one, is you can either, again, do nothing, but in this scenario, they all die, or you have to act. You're not just pulling a lever, you have to actually push the guy over. And then obviously again we have to create the premise that definitely stops the trolley. You know, you're not just that actual monster who does that.
On the
they all die.
presumption that it's definitely going to stop it, I still wouldn't do it.
Okay, because that changes it for some people, right? If they had to really do something, and then they'd feel more culpable, presumably.
Yeah, I find it really interesting why anyone would feel it's acceptable to put someone who is in no danger in the way of danger to save someone else against their own wishes.
Yes, I mean, that's the key part as well.
That just sounds.
He's
like
not saying, "Yeah, push me over, mate." That's fine. I'll save him.
Yeah, it just sounds terrible to me. I mean, this guy. I mean, who knows why these people are there? These people could be absolute morons and accepted what was obviously a trap to come and get kidnapped by a bunch of gangsters or something to put them on this train track for whatever reasons. They could have been there basically because of their own fault, and this other guy hasn't done anything wrong. He's got nothing to do with this. Why should his life be sacrificed? It's not fair to him. So no, I certainly wouldn't. Certainly not.
Okay, so then the last variant I had was one I came up with myself, because those ones are purposely made to be, like I say, nondescript people, where they're just trying to, I mean, you obviously can't, by the way we've unpacked it, but they're trying to assess, your moral compass or whatever.
Yeah.
So then this one, it might sound harsh, but I purposely designed this one myself, just because I want to see if you really are someone who, do you value, ideas of ethical values above everyday reality? So the harsh one is, if you could do the same scenario, but by whatever means, the person you have to sacrifice essentially is someone you love, but the people that are going to be killed, we're not going to say we'll know who they are. They're just random people. Would you actually, in that scenario, because I think this is an important question for people who want to talk about ethics and stuff, do you think you could actually do it? Would you be able to? What,
sacrifice someone I love to save 5 strangers?
Yes.
I don't think I'd sacrifice a stranger to save 5 strangers. Not in a scenario like that. So no.
You mean someone you love? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't think I could.
Okay.
Probably not, yeah.
Does that mean anything? Can you unpack that at all? I don't mean it to mean anything. I would like to know what you genuinely think.
Is the person I love basically the fat guy in the scenario? Yeah.
Or the person you have to divert the train onto. I mean, either way.
Either way. Yeah, I mean, in the scenario with the fat guy, I wouldn't push anyone. So I wouldn't push someone I love. But yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because, I mean, it would be the right thing to do to save the 5 lives, and they are obviously 5 people who aren't necessarily important to you, but they're certainly important to other people. And you're going to be talking about a much greater moral impact and emotional impact to more people. So you'll be doing more good by choosing the person you love. But can anyone really be asked to sacrifice the person they love for strangers? I mean,
sure, and it's hard, right?
Yeah, I mean, or can it not really bust, but can they be expected to say yes wholeheartedly and not then go back on it in the moment? And when it comes to the final decision, do they have the sort of fortitude of character? I don't even know if I would. So I mean, I'd be surprised if you could find many people who've put in that situation and it genuinely came down to the wire. They actually made the choice to let their wife die and let 5 people live. I think it'd be pretty tough for anyone to do it in real life. So.
Sure, because I mean, by the way, I have a similar thought. Like one thing, the reason why I wanted to ask the question as well is, like I say, I think a lot of people, especially if it's a hypothetical, might even say, if they think of themselves as a moralist, oh yes, well, I'd have to do it, for the betterment of society. But the difference is, would they actually in the scenario? Probably not. Yeah. So my question with that is, the reason why I designed that extra little one at the end is because I actually feel like whenever I myself try to take abstract philosophical ideas or political ideas and apply them to, like, if I actually was the person in charge or I was in some situation like that. A big problem I have is that I know there's a lot of situations where when we're talking about abstract people, I would make certain things that I thought make mathematical sense or I thought are just more fair. But I have to say, personally, if it was people that were involved with me, in a lot of scenarios, I would probably be what I would consider unethical if it was someone else. What do you think yourself in that respect?
I think if put in a position where I had to sacrifice someone I loved for people I didn't know I'd be doing the less than perfect thing by letting the people I don't know die. I'm well aware that I would be doing that, and I don't think that I could bring myself to sacrifice someone I loved. I still don't think I've got it in me, to be honest. I hope I don't have to try and choose. You know?
So this is an area in which I think everyone has this conflict, which is that when we think in an abstract sense, we're being rationalists, we're thinking with the intellect, but we're an animal, we're a primate. We have these. Well, we have hormones, emotions, all these things that can certainly have a powerful effect on us. Does it have any implication that most of us actually would break down our loftier ideas just when put into what could be everyday scenarios? I mean, that's a quite extreme one, admittedly. But yeah, this could happen at different times around the world in different periods of time.
Yeah, there's no doubt. People compromise their morals all the time, especially when they run out of options. It's just life. It's just what people do, and most of the time that's not even. Most of the time, it's not even in nefarious ways. Most of the time it's someone buying themselves a chocolate bar when they know they're on a diet. It's really petty things like that, or seeing someone drop a £10 note but thinking, I could use £10, and not telling them and then going and picking them up. They're not stealing from the person, but they are knowingly not helping them when they should be, and they know it. But it's not something that has a great effect on the world. It's just something small that people do. So yeah, okay, I've been thinking about this a lot actually recently. So there's this, especially on the internet, there's a fantasy that I think people on the internet hold to of the immaculate conception of principles. And if you don't hold them immaculate at all points in time in your life, then you are somehow less than a principled person.
Yes.
That, I think, is a falsehood, because the problem, it depends what you define as even a principled person. Because if you're defining it as someone who never goes back on their principles in any way, or is never a hypocrite or anything like that, you have no principled people in the world. And I don't agree that there are no principled people. I think that people are fallible and they make mistakes. And because someone did something last month doesn't mean they'll do something next month. People... they're flawed. They make mistakes. They sometimes give in to temptation. So I think I kind of prefer Aristotle's view, where it's the things you do make you what you are. So
habit.
Yeah, exactly, habit. And so if every now and again you do something bad, you know what I mean by bad, unethical. Sure. Not murder someone or something. Obviously, there are certain things that people do that are beyond the pale. But if every now and again you do something that's a bit dickish, but generally you're pretty good, I think that's as good as you can reasonably ask for, to be honest.
Okay, because one area that I thought was an interesting kind of meta question in a way about the debates you have and the people you engage with online and all this sort of thing is, I know myself, coming from the esports world, where again it's all online, these are communities of people where I think I know these people, I've talked to some of these people a long time. In fact, some of them I've never met, I've never interacted with them outside of their persona and these things, and I know it's very difficult for me to think the way I'm about to outline, but people do just become abstract in that sense, because again, you never really have to deal with the person. And I know that if they do behave in a certain way, or they do a certain thing, or they say something that it essentially, not just implying something, but they say something that seems heinous to me and whatever I hold to be reasonable, it is very, very tough to keep kind of thinking, like, how can I think from their perspective? Like, how can I be reasonable to them? How can I be generous to them in these, especially obviously if they're vitriolic to you? Is this tough for you?
It was, which is why I have so much grey in my beard. But no, it's not now. Now I think I have a better understanding of why they do it. I think most people forget that, like for example, today in Times Square there was an incident where I think it was a Mexican man drove a car off the road onto the curb, injured a bunch, 15 people and killed one or something like that. The internet wants to place blame, and these people want to place blame because they're culture warriors. They want to say, this is an example of your culture being bad, therefore my culture is superior. And I'm not making a moral judgment when I say that. That's just what they're doing. Everyone does it. So especially if they have an ideological worldview they want to put across, they want more people to agree with it. Everyone does it. It's just the way the game is played. Let's phrase it. Let me formulate this correctly, because otherwise someone will be incredibly uncharitable to me.
No doubt, yes.
I try to avoid doing all this sort of thing because it's basically desperation. And when you don't know and the facts come in, I mean, I've seen this kind of like claiming. It's almost like claiming territory, moral territory.
Yes.
With events to create a narrative to suggest that yours is better than theirs. And again, it's not a judgment, it's just what people do. And this is almost like when an event happens, culture warriors on all sides claw over it and try and grab as much to their narrative as they can. And often that's at the expense of someone else's narrative, because that becomes a thing they can't use because they're a bad person, because it's a bad thing. And the thing is, this in itself wouldn't be necessarily the worst thing in the world if there wasn't also the personal self-aggrandizement that came with it. As if adhering to these values makes you a moral person. I mean, one of the things that I think is politics is riddled with, and nobody even really thinks about it. Your politics don't actually make you a good person. Your politics are entirely about self-interest. Everyone's politics are entirely about self-interest. I mean, and even when you've got like, take a crass example like feminism, right? So you've got male feminists. You think, well, feminism is generally an anti-male movement. There's very little pro-male activism that comes out of feminism. Most of the time, it's women quotas and all this sort of thing, and that's at the expense of male candidates. It's at the expense of it could be a potentially like limitless almost number of male candidates, and it's a small amount of injustice that's distributed among them all. Basically, not a big deal. So nobody really thinks about it. But you would think that a man would instantly see that and think, well, that's not really helping me. In fact, that's directly, I mean, it's not a big deal. And this is something the BBC do. They have all women or all non-white jobs that only these people can go for, and basically white men can't go for. And I mean, I don't like that at all, but I haven't really done anything about it other than talk about it on the internet, because it's not something that affects me that much, and it doesn't impact my life greatly. But I can see that the philosophy that has produced jobs in the British, and I have to pay for this. I have to pay for my broadcasting BBC license, TV license. I would think the philosophy that is producing that is probably not in alignment with my particular values and interests. I don't think you should discriminate on gender, for a start. I don't think you should discriminate on race either, for or against. I just don't think that should be a category. And so I don't agree with these values. And to add insult to injury, it's targeting me as a white man. So I don't agree with that at all. You would think that other white men would see something similar and then go, well, okay, I'm not going to support intersectional feminism then, because it is effectively a power strategy against me. But there is a certain kind of man who does use this, who basically sees the benefits of joining it and being on the lower rung of a feminist system is more beneficial to him than not joining it and remaining on the lower rung that he's on now. This is something. It's
a strategy, right?
Absolutely. This is something that Professor Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan talked about in their podcast the other day, and I think they're absolutely correct. It is in many ways like a strategy to get near their mates or potential mates. And it's the only reason I can think of as to why a white man would do that. Because, or maybe, and this is something else I think is something quite common with the sort of man who joins these movements, guilt. They feel guilty about their past conduct to other women, and so are trying to cleanse their souls in some way.
Well, I mean, it's funny that people always use the term virtue signaling, because another aspect to that I think is a good way to frame it is if you've ever heard someone, okay, who used to be in some way a substance abuser, whether they're an alcoholic or they're a drug addict, when they tell you about it, they don't sound actually like, oh, yeah, I still feel bad about it now, like I was terrible. There's almost like a glee with how much they try to contrast how they're not that anymore, but how bad they were. And sometimes there's almost like a pornography to how they describe, oh, you don't know how bad I was, and I was doing this, and you know, it was really terrible. Because in doing so, they're kind of showing you, no, but now I've seen the light, you know, I understand that was wrong, and now I've changed the person. There's an element of this to the feminist ally, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The sort of element of redemption, I think. And I think that's one of the reasons why like churches were so involved with Alcoholics Anonymous. I think the sort of dichotomy of being evil and then becoming good was a way for, I think they were there offering something in a religious way, obviously, to give the person a sense of redemption. And it's not necessarily this, again, this it sounds bad when we say it, but it's just something that some people do. It's not, I mean, I guess what, you know, try to explain to people, look, if you were in that person's position, you would probably do the same, because you'd have all of the same system of incentives pushing you in that direction. So don't think of yourself as superior just because you don't.
But I mean, that's essentially one big part of this kind of a problem when we get into these very heated topics online. There's another thing that Jordan Peterson made a very good point about, which is that he said he had to go and study people who worked in Nazi death camps, because what he wanted to try and understand was how you become that person. And what he found out was, actually, if you ever look at like the day-to-day stuff, it's very mundane. They weren't like they picked out a serial killer. They took a normal guy who worked as a security guy or a cop, and they gradually turned him into that. And if you looked at his reasons, sometimes it was bizarre scenarios where they thought they were helping out their family or other people by doing it. It sounds crazy, but this is really what was going on. The point to make here is, if you can say at least, maybe I would do that in that person's position, you're actually very much ahead of the game, because a lot of the people we're talking about who have this very black and white world view, they will never acknowledge that. They would never be like you. They would never do the things you would do. And that's what makes you the permanent outgroup, you know?
Yeah, interesting you mention outgroups, because that's a really important concept here as well. So I was reading Gulag Archipelago today. A part of it, obviously, is huge. And I was very interested about the way he was describing the guards' relationship to the inmates in the gulags. They call them enemies of the people. And he had a segment about Marxist intellectuals in the Soviet Union who, when he's saying, and he's literally addressing them if they're reading the book, saying, look, you're probably reading this in the comfort of a leather chair, and you're probably thinking, well, this. And he starts anticipating their arguments and then counter-arguing against them for them. And one of them was his expectation of dismissal from them was for them to say, well, they were enemies of the people. And that Jordan Peterson made a great point. I interviewed Jordan Peterson a while ago. When he's talking about I think it's just scapegoating, putting all of the projecting all of the bad things about ourselves onto someone else and saying, right, they are the problem. If I can just get rid of them, that's the enemy. That's not how civilized life works. That's not how people work. That's not what we can actually do in a democracy. We can't just continue saying, oh, it's the other tribe who are the problem, and if they went away, everything would be fine. No. I mean, if you look, this is something the left wing has been doing for years now. They decry everything as being right wing, everything as being fascist or Nazi or whatever it is, and then saying, oh, it's okay for us to be violent towards them. I mean, and it's just like, look, do you understand that you're breeding bad people in your political movement by doing this? By suggesting that you can put all of the faults on someone else, you breed really selfish, self-righteous and deluded people who don't have an accurate view of themselves. So when they can't, when you do tell them something true about themselves, they can't stand to hear it. They have to block you. You get out. You can't possibly come in here and tell me something that might be true about myself, because that means I have to face the fact that I might actually be a total piece of shit. And that's a hell of a thing to walk yourself back from. If you have built up this moral, like Peterson described it as dead wood that needs to be burnt away. And a lot of people have a lot of it. And if you have to suddenly realize that there's no substance to any of this, and actually, if you were on the receiving end of the way you're treating someone else, you would hate that person, then you have to understand that you are the person who is doing wrong to others. That makes you the problem, and suddenly you have to own that. You have to morally accept that you are actually a piece of shit. And who wants to do that? And the further you go, the bigger piece of shit you are. I did a video called The Moral Rubicon about this idea, because with this Black Lives Matter activist called Ghazi Kozo, because basically he is the world's biggest racist. It's just he does it to white people, and so nobody cares.
Yes.
And it's like, no, this guy is absolutely awful. And of course he comes from a wealthy background, because they all do. And they are just awful people. And it's you've got to come to the point where it's like, look, there is really no walking this back, is there? Because I mean, you would have to display so much contrition to the people that you have been belittling, insulting, degrading, demeaning for years. You'd probably have to go and become a priest or something, not even priest, but like a monk or something. You'd have to just spend your life giving alms for the poor and stuff for the rest of your life to make up for the moral deficit you have accrued up until this point. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's so hard to persuade people out of this kind of cult-like mentality, because I think that subconsciously there's a part of them that knows, look, if this isn't all as I'm saying it is, then holy shit, do I have a lot to answer for. And I think that's why they keep going. I think that's why they keep
doubling down.
Doubling down and doubling down, because there is simply no walking this back, and they know it. And the hell are they going to do that when it's they're already right at the precipice, so they can just take another step and another step, and suddenly everyone's a Nazi. Everyone who disagrees with me should have their accounts shut down. I think that's the problem that they're in, and I don't think there's any walking it back for them. I honestly don't.
So there's kind of a bizarre principle at work here, which is everyone's heard the famous kind of adage, okay, which is that in polite company or with friends and family, you don't talk about politics and religion.
Yeah.
And so one of the reasons why is kind of as we've been outlining here, they're such fiery topics that as soon as you even get into them, people naturally take on this thinking like that. There's my position, there's the out group, how if you can possibly think that, then I make all these moral assumptions about you.
Yeah.
And yet the funny thing about it is, if they thought to themselves what the party they were in was like a minute before you went onto that topic, they must know that everyone can't really all have thought the same thing, and everyone was fine. We were all getting along, we're all living our lives. That's a person. I'm not sure what he thinks yet. So is there ever a way we can actually get it so that we can talk about these topics without essentially having to talk to the people who agree with us? Because this seems to be a common trend at the moment, that as soon as we each define our terms, we have drawn the line in the sand.
Yeah, it's really easy, actually. You just have to remove the moral judgment from the discussion. If you want, just assume you're talking to a Nazi. You could just assume that everyone you talk to is essentially the worst you're going to deal with. And so you might get very depressed, thinking, oh my God, I am surrounded by terrible people. But at the end of the day, you're going to become numb to it and go, well, okay, they're all terrible people. Okay, well then I'll have to try and explain to them why they're being terrible people. And there's no point berating them because none of them think they're terrible. And this is something that annoys me, because that's obviously the worst case scenario. What you should actually do is assume good faith on the part of the person you're talking to. It's hardly rocket science. And the thing is, I can't imagine that most people, even most people who disagree with me, adopt their positions because they are malevolent. They must in some way think that they're beneficent. And this is, you can contrast any school of political thought for this. So, if we took someone like, say, one of the worst people for, in my opinion, moral standing on the internet is Andrew Anglin. He runs the Daily Stormer.
Okay, for sure, yeah. I can imagine where this is going.
Yeah, the Daily Stormer is like a parody site. If I thought that they were trying to discredit white nationalism, I would say the Daily Stormer was like a CIA operation or something.
It's like the Onion of that.
Yes, it's hilarious to read. I'm not gonna lie, it's genuinely funny because it's just ridiculous, and you never know what kind of. It's like reading extreme feminist stuff. You just don't know what kind of ridiculous bullshit you're gonna hear next.
Yeah.
And then on the other side of that, you've got like the socialists, the really sort of hardcore, international revolution of the proletariat types, and they both. I mean, they hate each other more than anything, and yet they both are basically operating under the same principles. They are convinced that, okay, there will be a time of pain. However, at the end of this time of pain, we will have done a huge good for everyone that survives. And they're not especially moral people, so they don't care about the people dying. But often they're the problem. But yeah, so I mean, like for the white nationalists, obviously, when and I'm not saying white nationalists are trying to kill people or anything like that. I'm not even saying Andrew Anglin trying to kill people, but they are going to invariably infringe on people's rights. You know, there's no legal ground to simply kick out non-white people from a country at all. You're going to have to break laws to do that. I mean, in like say the United States, and even the United Kingdom, you do have we've got an unwritten constitution, but we still have a constitution. And you can't just extradite people to nowhere either.
Sure.
So it's not like there's any legal ground for any of it. So it's not going to happen. Which is why invariably, I'm sure that if you asked Andrew Anglin, he'd have to be suggesting some kind of revolution, because there's simply no legal method to do it. You couldn't do it within a democratic framework. So he would have to be advocating for some sort of extrajudicial and extra legal, I don't know, deportations or something. By the same token, the socialists are convinced that once when nobody owns property, then basically crime ends, because a lot of crime is property crime. And sure. That is true. Some crime will end, in the same way that if you legalize marijuana, weed crime will end. You know, of course it will. It's not illegal anymore, but that's not the problem. The problem, from my perspective, is that why should I lose my property rights just because you think it's a good idea? These are my rights, and this is why we have a government to enforce them. But they're convinced that if people's rights are violated, eventually we will get to a point where they will no longer be being violated. And they will tell you that they're doing these things out of good intentions, because they are looking at it from a macro scale rather than a sort of more individual scale. And unfortunately for the people at the individual scale, that means that a bunch of them are going to get thrown under the bus. So yeah, I can't even remember the point I was trying to make, but this is basically how they're both morally the same and both as morally reprehensible. And so this is what it actually drives me crazy when I see
your point was like not to, if you just take moral judgments out, you can have the same political opinions, etc., and you don't have to essentially be incapable of even getting along. Yeah,
you basically do have to just remove your moral judgment from any political discussion you're having. But yeah, it drives me crazy though. Since I've gotten to the topic, I've currently got a hammer and sickle in my Twitter name, just because I can.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, it's to piss them off, because they know I'm not. But the point is also that Twitter, why can I have a communist symbol in my Twitter name but not a swastika? There is no swastika emoji. Why not? No. You know, these things are not morally different in any way, shape, or form. And if we're going to go by, body counts, then the communists are worse. So, you know, I'm really tired of this sort of communist rehabilitation in society. And I'm saying that as someone who is a liberal in the tradition of like Hobbes and Adam Smith and Locke and Hayek. You know, I'm thinking from the position of a free market capitalist British liberal man, thinking, why the hell is communism making a return? This is horrific. I'm actually genuinely worried about it, to be honest. I mean, like in Britain, the Labour Party's riddled with communists. I mean, actually, you know, full-on communists who are, or like they will call themselves socialists, but ultimately And that's actually, okay, yeah, I should say socialist, but Marxian socialists. And that's what the Soviet Union was.
Okay, so this is a topic that I obviously I had planned at some point to get into, because you have to talk about gender politics, essentially.
Basically,
but you have said in the past, like you referred here, that you think of yourself as a classical liberal.
Yes.
And the problem is, you yourself are someone who, as a catch-all phrase, uses the term liberal. And if people watched your videos and they hadn't heard what you just said there, they would think, no, you're against liberals. In fact, they might even naively think that means you're some sort of conservative. But
Yeah.
what do you see as the distinction then between classical liberal values and what we have now, which, as you say, it's if not communism, it's very close in as much as it's Neo-Marxism or whatever it might be termed,
Yeah, I think there are some important lines to be drawn, actually, and I think that a lot of people are lazy when it comes to these. I think the first thing we need to do is divorce things from ideas. For example, feminism is not women, and so attacking feminism is not attacking women. Zionism is not Jews, and so attacking Zionism is not attacking Jews. In the same way, social programs are not socialism. So if I said I think a social program is a good idea, that does not make me a socialist. That just means we have an overlapping agreement on one idea.
Okay, well, I mean, just to interject here, you have actually said you are potentially in favour of socialised healthcare, welfare,
absolutely.
obviously things that we have in the United Kingdom. So how do you equate that with liberal values then?
Okay, this is something that's actually covered by Hayek in The Road to Serfdom. The classical liberalism is generally considered to be a right-wing philosophy, and I understand why, because there are schools of thought. And again, this whole subject just goes completely untouched by so many people, and it really drives me crazy. So there are schools of thought that are, say, someone like Mises. They want as minimal government as possible. The justification of government interference is always not good enough. And then there are schools of thought where it's more you get more people like Hayek who are more open to the idea, because it's all about how it fits into the framework of the principles. The classical liberalism is an individualist philosophy. It's for the common good, not the greater good, is the best way to define it. So everyone, but not most. And so if you have, say, a welfare state, there's nothing wrong with how. Welfare state's the wrong term. A social safety net is what Hayek describes, and I agree with him. I think Thomas Sowell actually makes a good and persuasive argument against a large-scale welfare state. Not only does it cost money, but it's a bad system of incentives, and you've got to look at reality and say, okay, that is a bad system of incentives. But anyway, so Hayek, I think it's page 124 of The Road to Serfdom, he explains that basically it doesn't matter whether the state regulates or not, as long as the regulations are universal. It's the same thing with, say, a social safety net. If you become unemployed, anyone in society who becomes unemployed should be able, it would be beneficial to society, and the system, a market system can easily bear the weight of having to have a social safety net that everyone pays into, obviously pays taxes, and everyone benefits from. It doesn't harm any individual liberties. It doesn't infringe on anyone's freedom. It doesn't in any way violate the principles of individualism. And it's the same with socialized healthcare. If everyone gets it and everyone who works pays for it, then how is that violating anyone's principles of individualism? I just don't see the argument there. And so I think that there is definitely a sort of center-right, center-left breach, or not breach, but sort of span across there, and usually it's interpreted center-right. But there's nothing to say that there can't be social programs. But don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing for unnecessary government expansion or anything like that. That just seems like a waste on a pragmatic level.
Okay, so then the obvious question here then goes like this: the things you were describing there are essentially, they sound like classical conservatism. And what now is usually referred to as like libertarian, the idea of individuals' rights. But you're saying in general. But obviously, the term liberal, as we're talking about in the context here, has been taken now to mean anything on the left wing.
Well, liberal and progressive are words that you use they're synonymous at this point. And same with socialist. I've heard so many liberals tell me they're socialists, and I've just looked at them with raised eyebrows. No, you're not a socialist, or you're not a liberal. It's you choose. Because I mean, the question, it really boils down to and this is the question that literally everyone now has to ask themselves: do you want equality of opportunity, or do you want equality of outcome? They're your choices. Okay. And you've got to pick one, and you will not get the other one. This is something that drives me crazy, and it's everywhere. I mean, like Macron just put out his new parliament. Oh, I made sure we've got 50% women. Why? Why did you choose 50%? Because it would be the same. Why though? What was the difference? What's the difference between having, like, in Britain we've got something like 33% that's women, and I don't care what the percentage of women is. In fact, I don't care what the percentage of it is at all. If it was full of women, I wouldn't care. I would be more concerned about the policies of the women involved, like the individuals that we were talking about. Sure. And
I mean, to put that in a framework, essentially, if it was a system that wasn't just reverse engineered to get the number, you'd be okay with it being 75% women. But yeah, that's better than if you literally reverse engineer it to be 50% no matter what.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, not only basically at that point you're quota filling, so you are, because if in a natural system, if in a meritocratic system, which is, we actually still do run a meritocratic system. A lot of people will tell you we don't, and they'll say that on the basis that it's not perfect. No, sure. It's not perfect, but it's still pretty meritocratic, and the United States still is as well. And it's also not a racist country in the way that the left will tell you it's a racist country. But anyway, yeah. So if you would normally have 30%, 70% split, you can be reasonably sure that the people who are in those positions are actually well qualified and the best in their field, or at least in that present time, with all of the stipulations that you would normally put around a statement like that. So, sure, yes. Practical individual events in people's lives that would, might otherwise prevent them, notwithstanding, to the best of a free society's ability, you've probably got the best people there. Whereas if you then say, right, okay, we're actually going to arbitrarily cap it at 50-50, then you can be sure that around 15% of the people who would otherwise, and this doesn't have to be male or female, this could be anything, and this could be any field as well. I mean, we could be talking nursing, where you normally have like 25%, if 15 to 25% men, and 75 to 85% women. If you were to then cap that at 50% men, you could probably be sure that you're getting men doing that job who will probably not as good as the women you're preventing from taking those positions. Otherwise, they would have got them on their natural merits. But you artificially prevented them, from these women, from taking those positions, and instead forced the number of men back. So you've probably got people who are not as good as the people you have actually refused for the jobs. Sure. And I don't like that. I really don't like that. And to the fact that you're then discriminating on the basis of gender, which it's not something I want in a society. I don't want societies that discriminate on race or gender or sexuality, because as far as I'm concerned, these are things you don't get to choose and you can't really change. I'm not, generally don't change. So I just don't want that to be a criteria that we judge people on. I don't like that at all.
So this obviously neatly brings us into the topic of gender politics, and the first place I became aware of this, because in general I wasn't somebody who read a lot of political stuff, I'm immersed kind of in my own subculture, was when it started to infringe on my subculture of gaming, which is obviously the Gamergate scenario that happened, which has been much spoken about, and essentially I would draw it to a larger principle of what I then learned about social justice warriors, etc., and I would explain it like this. The reason why initially I was actually quite shocked, at first I heard some of the stories and I was like, well, again, is this going to affect my life? And at the time it seemed like no, because I thought, right, it's a load of blogs and it's people who make videos, but I'm in my kind of little cocoon. And the moment I realized it was significant is when I saw that thanks to things like quotas and thanks to protesting certain things, the area I find it very egregious is where they crowbar their way into the field of art. So now games are an obvious example, but you can see movies, comics, and these are areas in which obviously, here's the thing. If someone wrote a fantastic comic book that was about a gay superhero, if it's a really great comic book, I wouldn't care. Just, I don't want someone to, again, quote a Phil and just make a superhero gay for no reason, and then have someone who's not equipped write it, or someone write it with some weird political agenda, you know. I'm just worried about it ruining the art, essentially, and that was my concern. So the question I have is this. I was very worried when I first heard about these things, and I heard about like some of the things Marvel had done and what was happening with like representation in movies, and you hear all the stuff about the Oscars every year. I got really worried because initially I thought, like, this is kind of a tide you can't stem. It feels like it's overwhelming, you know? But one thing I found very confusing, and I want to get your take on this, is I'll give you an example specifically from my world of esports, and this will maybe illustrate why I don't necessarily, I don't have hope, but I'm not totally giving up on the idea that it's over. Because, okay, in my world of esports, there are very few women who actually follow esports. If you ever look up the real numbers, and we're talking about actual esports, you know, very competitive FPS games.
I know what you mean.
Sure. Well, the whole point is, I'm not talking about Bejeweled or something, you know, the ones they pad the stats with to show that it'll be a 50-50 split. So my point is, in these fields, as a result, women pro gamers, there aren't very many of them, and the ones that there are, they don't get much aside from, you know, artificial marketing budgets, etc. They don't get many people watch them play. So in the same sense, the reason why I'm drawing this parallel is, if there really was 50% women in esports, and there's all these women who want to be pro gamers, and some of them are, you would think naturally the market would adjust, and those women would say, right, well, we'll show it by watching the women play. They'll get quite a bit of viewership. They'll get their own, you know, everything will naturally take place where people will follow the money, and eventually there would be representation anyway. Now, the reasons why there aren't, as I'm sure you know, is the metrics don't work whatsoever. Like, the very few women there are don't want to watch the women play often. There aren't enough of them anyway to support it. And so I want to know, is it naive of me to think that this will work on a bigger scale? Because my hope is, if there really are so few, for example, I mean, there's already very few transsexual people anyway, but of the ones that there are, there's very few who actually really care deeply and would only watch something with a transsexual person in. So I feel as though, am I naive to think that the actual metrics won't work for this as well? Like, their own idea of what will be success won't kind of be reflected when they have a representation. It'll collapse in on itself. Is there hope?
Yeah, absolutely. It's inevitable. They're going to fail, so they shouldn't try. There's a documentary called The Norwegian Gender Paradox.
Yes, I saw this. I remember you referenced it when you were talking Destiny.
Yeah, and it's just one of those things that you have to watch, because, I mean, Norway basically did everything they could to get women to be fully represented in fields like construction and mining and things like this. Sure. Naturally, it didn't happen because you just can't make women do jobs they don't want to do. And this was the same with the Oculus team, where you saw the interview with it. Was it John Carmack?
It could have been, yeah. I mean, he's the guy from the id Software who works with Oculus now.
Yeah, I can't remember who it was. It was in 2013, I think this interview was. They were giving a presentation on a stage, and they were taking questions. And a pink-haired social justice warrior turns up and puts her hands on her hips and goes, "Why don't you have more women on your team?" or something along the lines.
Okay.
And you could see the fear in their faces. They were like, "Oh God, what are we going to say?" And the chap just took the mic and said, because they're simply not turning up to the interviews. They're not coming forward and saying, we want to be part of this endeavor, because they just don't want to, I guess. I mean, there's simply no other way of explaining it, as far as I can tell. Either, actually, no, there's two ways. Either there is a giant conspiracy of men trying to bully women out of spaces and make sure they don't get interested in things by making them unfriendly to women or something.
Which is obviously their framework that they believe is the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is the moral judgment they fling at everyone. Or it's just that these are not things that generally appeal to women. And I mean, you know, if you ask a woman just find a random woman around you and ask them why they're not in an esports game or, you know, pro player. Sure. They'll tell you because they don't want to. And it's just, there's nothing you can do about this. They're never going to be able to find enough women to become 50% of the steel industry or something like that. You know, it's just never going to happen. And the same thing is going to be true for esports, because whether they like it or not, there are legitimately gender preferences, and they're not 100% of one way or another, but there's always a huge, just a landslide number of either men or women in these particular kind of endeavors. And I'm guessing it's down to the biology of it. I'm guessing it's down to the functional biological differences between men and women. It doesn't mean that women should be kept out of anything. It doesn't mean that men should be kept out of anything. It's just the reason that some things appear to be gendered and others don't. That's my opinion.
So an area I wanted to go with this is, again, like I say, when I was first encountering this stuff, I thought to myself, like a lot of people who want to be fair, you know, and not think that everyone's one way or another, I thought to myself, right, well, these are obviously just very radical people. Like, for example, I do sometimes get a little bit annoyed by the fact that people will be like, you should see what social justice warriors do next. And then you look and it's like a blog that would have had 10 hits if we hadn't have all clicked it and said, this is a disgrace. You know, it wasn't literally like Saul Alinsky is back from the grave. Like, this is the plan that we're all going with. Has everyone got the memo? You know, it's not that crazy. But one area I do think that's an interesting principle is this is a principle that I know Sam Harris often makes when he talks about radical Islam, which is that the problem isn't if there's only a few radicals. It's if you can genuinely talk to the people who should be considered moderates. If you find out that they essentially agree with all that, prop it all up, and, you know, there but for the grace of God would be they themselves if they had been in a more extreme situation. That's where you get a bit worried, you know, if there really is a big undercurrent. So what is actually your sense? Are there a lot of people who, if they aren't directly radicalized in this respect for gender politics, etc., are there a lot of people you think who actually buttress that up? Yeah,
absolutely. Ideological permissiveness is a real problem, and it's just inevitable, because I've noticed there is definitely a pattern when it comes to the development of an ideological group. It might start off fairly large and fairly powerful because of its size, but over time you will get the radicals, and they will essentially out-argue everyone on the grounds of ideological purity, and eventually it will get to the point where the entire discussion is centered around the concept of ideological purity, and anyone on the outside of that, even slightly impure, will be heaped scorn upon. And the people doing it will be doing it for their own self-aggrandizement. And so, and you see this all the time. There was a famous feminist community, actually. It was the funniest one. There were articles about this on the internet, where it was about 15,000 strong feminist community, and then it ended up absolutely eating itself alive through just purity tests, non-stop. This person is not feminist enough, and anything that occurred that could be given an ideological dimension was used to attack someone. And that's another thing as well. People are often not just pointing these things out. These are attacks on your character, attacks on you, and attacks on your power, and that's what they're going for. And power is a really important thing to talk about in these situations as well, because especially with social justice, be aware that social justice itself is a power tactic.
Yes.
The concept of social justice is inseparable from institutional power. They are convinced everything is defined in terms of power. They're not principles. They're not talking about principles. You're probably saying, well, it's wrong to discriminate on the basis of race. Sure. Well, that's not the principle they hold. They are concerned. They are looking instead at the real world context of what's happening and applying power dynamics instead. They are saying, right, there are 75% white people, 25% black people. Therefore, black people are being oppressed on the basis that more white people exist. That's not true. That's not necessarily true at all. I mean, it could be the other way around. We could be looking at like Mughal India, in which you had a minority caste oppressing the vast majority. Just because there are more doesn't mean anything. But more than that, it's not even two-dimensional, but it's a flat. It is two-dimensional. It's a flat way of looking at the world.
Sure.
It doesn't encapsulate the other dimensions. It's specifically leaving them out by focusing all on one, and adopting a sort of single layer lens. But yeah, it's all focused on power. You just can't define any of their terms without power. Racism is prejudice plus power. Sexism is prejudice plus power. That's all it is. And so when someone is looking at you through the lens of power dynamics, you have to look back at them through the very same lens. because otherwise they have an advantage over you, and they're going to use it. And I think this is why, because I mean, most people in interpersonal interactions do not look at each other through this lens. It's totally inappropriate. You know, that's what bad people do. In fact, they look for a way to get one over on someone else so they can basically increase their own influence at their expense. That's what a bad person does. A person who goes around doing that in daily life is a piece of shit, and you can't trust them because they're going to backstab you the first chance they get. That's not what a good person does. But that's what social justice warriors do. Now, that's not necessarily everyone with like what is usually termed on the internet regressive beliefs. You know, things like it's okay to discriminate on gender, or you know, quotas, or censoring people is another one. That's not what everyone who holds those beliefs does. But the term social justice warrior is, I think, specifically referencing a type of person who does look at the world exclusively through the lens of power dynamics, and so will happily screw over an individual on the basis that they're, say, white or whatever. Yes. And it's okay. It's the greater good again. Suddenly it's for the people. Basically, you've got to be aware that they're doing it to you. That's it. You don't have to do it back to them, but you have to be aware they're doing it to you so you can see what they're doing sometimes. Because sometimes they might be trying to screw you over, and you don't deserve to get screwed over if you're just wandering around being a normal person.
So, I mean, this reminds me of a classic, I thought a very witty line that Christopher Hitchens had, which was that if the church was what it even probably on some level believes it is, you know, it's all about morals and God's commandments, and the idea is they always preach, you know, the notion that it's about the afterlife. But his line was, you know, if it's about the afterlife, why do all of their actions seem to be about power in this life here? And you know, it has no bearing on the afterlife. You know, you wouldn't need to accrue riches and all these take territories and stuff. It's all about the afterlife. So again, as you're saying, you have to obviously be very aware that these people are. Here's the thing: if they really were just on a blog somewhere, like I said, I wouldn't mind. You can say whatever you want on this crazy blog to all your friends, but it's if you're then going to enact that in some way into life, obviously that eventually comes into our life. That's where the concern is. So, okay, I have a question for you. I noticed that in a bunch of videos I've seen, you don't use the popular term cultural Marxism, which obviously Jordan Peterson famously uses often. Yeah. You prefer to say Neo-Marxist. Now, can you explain the distinction?
Okay, Neo-Marxist is actually the political science term for them. Okay. Cultural Marxism is a colloquial term that was invented by like the right wing or something, you know, some conservative Christians or something. And it comes with it a feeling of conspiracy. The thing is, it's not, and it's true.
So it just has a stigma with it.
Yeah, it comes with a stigma. Basically, Neo-Marxism is essentially a French school of thought that originated in the 60s with people like Foucault, and they are essentially taking Marxism is expressly materialist and expressly economic. That's the only distinction the Marxist lens draws. Basically, the neo-Marxists are redrawing the boundaries of that and applying it to race, gender, and this is from out of this, and postmodernism is born the philosophy of intersectional social justice. And so, I don't tend to use the term cultural Marxism because it comes laden with baggage, but that's what they're referring to when they say cultural Marxism. This is heavily influenced by the Frankfurt School. These are all things you should look up as well. I mean, the Wikipedia articles on the fine. They work. They will give you a working knowledge of what you're dealing with. They won't make you an expert in it, obviously, but you'll understand the basics of what's happening. So look, if you want to know, look up neo-Marxism and look up the Frankfurt School. And there are probably loads of YouTube videos dealing with it, but I would be picky about the sources because, I mean, I really don't like these things, but I think that lots of people are emotionally primed not to like these things. Right. And you've got to be aware of sources like that because they're not going to give you the most accurate information because they're going to be really biased. And I'm not saying the bias is illegitimate either. You know, it might well be a legitimate bias. Sorry, it's got dark over here.
I can still see you fine.
That's okay.
It's okay for you.
No, that's fine. But yeah, so they're going to have a lot of bias. That doesn't necessarily mean they're inaccurate, but I don't think you're going to be getting a full picture of it. You're better to go somewhere that you can be more certain of neutral input. Now, I'm not saying Wikipedia is the best place for that.
For sure, yes.
But it's a tough one, basically. Essentially, what you want to do is read pro and anti sources. But this is then becoming a lot of research for the average person to do. Yeah. And so, basically, the Wikipedia articles will give you enough input. That'll do if you're wondering.
So one person, and we've already referenced him a few times in this show already, is Jordan Peterson, this professor from the University of Toronto. Yes. And it's funny that obviously his rise to fame came because of this very specific bill in Canada that was to do with the use of gendered pronouns. And what's funny is I think a lot of people think that it's just the fact that he's like one of the rare intellectuals who took a stand against this, that his popularity comes from. But I know myself, when I watched his Joe Rogan appearances, obviously the interview with you, etc., one of the reasons why I actually think he's caught on and kind of set alight the people who are essentially, if not against, they're worried about these things, is that because of his background, he's very cleverly framed the whole discussion. So he's obviously brought up this topic of dominance hierarchies, and it's a different way to think about it, because what's good is, to tie into what we were discussing earlier, it actually almost gives you a compassion for the people who are doing these, to us, ethically fucked up things, because you see them within the hierarchy and how they're trying to navigate it. And so I actually think, in a bizarre way, obviously someone like him didn't have to come around, but they couldn't have known it. But these people and the way they were operating by taking over the academic, facilities, in a weird way, they were almost summoning someone like this, because they were going through the places that have all the people who are very learned, and eventually they've managed to get one who has spent his whole life studying like communism, this exact sort of like dominance hierarchies, psychological principles, and then on top of it they got the one that wasn't going to say no, or wasn't going to just sit back and let it all happen. So in a weird way, they've themselves summoned forth, it feels like, Jordan Peterson, who seems to be doing a very good job of kind of not necessarily shutting them down, but kind of just pulling back the veil a little, showing you the mechanisms that are at work, right?
I think it's very interesting that he's a psychologist, because he approaches it from the position of the individual making the choices through the ideological lens, why they want to do that. Because I mean, at any given point, you could turn around and say, you know what, I actually feel like kind of a National Socialist. I actually think that if we just got rid of the Jews, and you could go down this at any point, you could just allow yourself to be persuaded by the easy answer of let's just get rid of that group, But it's never just one group. They wish life was that simple. And Jordan Peterson approaches it from the position of the person adopting that, and he psychoanalyzes why they would need to do this in order to try and deprogram them from it. And I think, I think that is really the reason why he's really taken off, because, so much of this kind of ideological posturing and grandstanding is about your ego. It's about trying to make yourself feel like a good person. I find Jeremy Corbyn supporters insufferable 9 out of 10 times, because they are absolutely the very worst of regressive moralizers. They will sit there and say, we're doing this for the people. It's like, okay, well, how much charity have you done this year? None. They want someone else to do it, and they think that if they hold the belief and make that happen, then someone doing charity by proxy is somehow a substitute for them doing charity themselves. No, go out, and it's like Jordan Peterson saying, do something practical yourself, and you will find not only the world around you is better, but you don't feel like you're not doing anything. You'll feel like you're doing something. You will fulfill that urge. Because the thing is, that's another thing. These people, the urge is obviously coming from a place of good intentions, that it always is. And
yes,
I read Proposed Roads to Freedoms by Bertrand Russell a few days ago. Excellent book. If anyone wants to know what on earth all of this is all about, read that. He's got some fantastic and concise descriptions that are completely accurate. But one of the points that he makes is, because he was quite a socialist himself, he just didn't think that socialism as it was being packaged was going to work, or socialism or anarchism, but not a huge amount of difference in the end result, to be fair. But both equally as unlikely. And he didn't think they were going to work because of the sort of nature of it. But he made the point that the people involved, even the most die-hard activists who seem like terrible people, think they're working from a position of good intentions. The problem is their moral paradigm has shifted. And so the things you find moral, they don't consider moral at all. They consider like, you know, seizing the means of production to be a moral thing. But I don't think going into a guy's business and stealing his factory from him, a shop from him, is a moral thing to do. I think that's immoral. And this lens has basically changed their moral paradigm. But they still think they're being good people. And that's the thing that is really hard to remember sometimes, because sometimes these people can be absolutely terrible, but they genuinely think they're being good people. That's the important thing to remember. Sure.
So another topic that I know you've mentioned numerous times, in fact you did a whole video on it, which I'd recommend people go and see if they want a good primer, is, as I referenced before, Saul Alinsky in his book Rules for Radicals. And most famously, I found out about this because I remember people telling me during the American election that actually Hillary Clinton essentially is of this school of thought. Like, this is one of the people who was like a mentor figure for her or something. And so in a sense, you can see why these social justice warriors and her were aligned at that particular moment in time. And the reason why this is an interesting topic, and I'd recommend people who are interested in the topic of social justice warriors look into this, is because it'll take away a lot of the notion that these people are just haphazardly doing this stuff. The whole point is they actually have a framework and a plan of action for how they want to essentially do things that go against like liberal values, like shut down people's ability to speak, you know, make them look very bad, literally in some cases, you know, uproot them, isolate them from the pack. I mean, I know this is a topic you've talked about, so could you give an overview as to what the issue is here with the fact this exists?
Right. Okay. So this is directly within the domain of what we would call culture wars. Rules for Radicals is a manual of tactics. It was written by a small c communist called Saul Alinsky. He wasn't a communist ideologue. In fact, he wasn't an ideologue of any stripe. He was very pragmatic. In fact, if you read it, then you can read through his thoughts on the entire thing, because he explains that he is someone who is, and he has what he calls the ideology of change. And there are certain ways that you have to be in order to make things happen. Okay. And that's what he advocates people do. Now, he's not saying that people need to burn things down or anything like that. Nothing he suggests is illegal. That's the important thing to remember. Okay. And I think the most important thing, and this is something that right-wingers can't do, apparently. I've desperately tried to talk to right-wingers about this, and they just won't have any of it. Saul Alinsky wasn't a bad person. So and don't get me wrong, he had questionable contacts, absolutely. But I don't think he was operating from a position of bad intentions. He was a civil rights activist in many times. So, and he spent a lot of time like on the ground working in these communities. Okay. So I don't think he was a bad person or anything like this. But Rules for Radicals is a manual of tactics, in the same way that The Prince is a manual of tactics, or the same way that The Art of War is a manual of tactics, or any famous manual of tactics. It's just that the Prince and Rules for Radicals are basically the mirror image of each other. The Prince is for the people with power on how to hold on to it. And yes. Alinsky says at the beginning of Rules for Radicals, this is the mirror to the Prince. This is for the people who don't have power to take it away from the people who do have power. So basically what you need to do is look at your position in the hierarchy of society and pick which one you need if you wish to play the game of culture wars. Which I don't recommend people do, to be honest. Sure. I would not. If I were you, unless you want to be an activist, and that's what an activist is. An activist is someone who is engaged in a culture war. They want you to think ideas that you don't already think, and probably go counter to what you actually think already, and it's to the benefit of their cause. So the more people who think and act along their line of values, the more moral territory you can say that they've captured. And this is why Lacey Green daring to speak to anti-feminist types on YouTube was such a big deal to them, because it looked to them like they were effectively losing a province, a big, powerful, rich province in someone with a huge reach, because they were deigning to kind of go over to the other side and talk to them and be pally with them. That basically they look at themselves like ideological sovereigns, and they don't want enemy sovereigns, enemy ideologies encroaching on their territory. So yeah, anyway, rules for radicals. It's to basically allow the powerless people to use their power. Hillary Clinton can't use rules for radicals. She is the powerful person. She did do, I think it was her dissertation on rules for radicals, and I think she knew Saul Alinsky as well. Yes. But interestingly, she hasn't taken that road. She instead married Bill. He became governor of Arkansas, and then president. She's never had to use rules for radicals. It's interesting that she's got that on her CV, basically. No, for Hillary Clinton, she needs to use the prince, even out of power now, because, I mean, Trump may have won the election, but Hillary has got so much institutional power through her personal connections that it's impossible to underestimate that. You know, if Hillary Clinton wants to make something happen, she'll be able to make it happen. So she'll just be pulling the strings, basically, like, you know, asking favors and whatnot. And this is all completely normal. This is not like conspiratorial. This is just things that people do in politics. They do them all the time. You know, everyone does these. There's no getting around it. There's probably no getting anything done without it. So yeah, but basically, rules for radicals is something that anyone who is on the losing end of a culture war, you should read it and you should use it. Because there's nothing in them that's illegal. It's all just things that are designed to sway public opinion. And one of the ways that the anti-feminist, I don't want to call it a movement because it's really not. It's basically a coalition of a bunch of different ideologies that have overlapping goals.
Yes.
In a lot of ways, freedom of speech is one of the core goals. That's the thing that's first to go, and I think is the most fundamental to the rest of them. Being able to speak out against things that are done to you is always the first to go, and you need it to let people know that things are being done to you. So whenever someone gets censored, that's the first step on a bad road. And it doesn't, you know, I mean, okay, so it was just like, say, with video games, big deal. Well, I'm sorry, I spend a lot of time and effort and money on video games. Yeah. I've got, like, I don't know, something like 3,000 hours logged on Arc. You know, I've got, I don't want these people just taking over this space and then telling me I can't speak in it. I don't see why I should allow, that should be allowed. Because, I mean, the people who start restraining your speech, eventually they're going to be telling you what games you can and can't make. Then they're going to be, they'll be telling you how to make them. Then you can't make them. And then suddenly the industry's died because it's rotted out from within because of these cancerous ideologues. I mean, Marvel Comics is a great example of this. Yeah. They utterly prostrated themselves before the cult of diversity. And then they had to come out and say, we have to take away diversity because people don't want women in their comics. I mean, it's just, I saw the anger online from these people because I was just like, Jesus Christ, that is the worst thing that Marvel could have said to them. They couldn't have said anything worse than we've got to stop diversity because people don't like women on comics. And the thing is, that's not even true. You know,
that's the get out though, right? Essentially, they shift the blame to people who read comics.
Well, kind of, but it's more like what they really are actually saying is that people don't like intersectional social justice. Because I mean, if you've had Wonder Woman and all sorts of like Rogue from X-Men, all these, I haven't read comics for years, but there have always been really popular female characters.
Sure.
They always have. For at least my lifetime, I remember reading comics as a kid. And I used to love things like, X-Men and Spider-Man and all that sort of stuff, Fantastic Four. But yeah, it's not that people care whether there are women in them or not. What they care about is the fact that an ideology has come in and effectively colonized somewhere that was originally quite a liberal space. And when I say liberal, I don't really mean I mean free and open.
Yes.
You could effectively make anything. I mean, and all of a sudden these people have come in and taken it over. And so, I mean, having Captain America side with Hydra, that should give you the sort of indications. I mean, I know it was all a ploy or something, blah blah blah, sure. But it's a statement, and the implication is this is like suddenly there is a common ground between these two, and that's ridiculous. They're mortal enemies, but it's an ideology that basically wants to hedge everything else out, and if you're not playing by their rules, then they don't want you to play at all. And playing by their rules is stifling. People don't want that. People know that this is being done forced. It's being done artificially. I mean, you can look at communist art and Nazi art from the periods, and it's sterile. It's boring. It's the most bland-looking workers in the fields, and they're all happy and smiling. Everything's great. And it's like, this is not a piece of art. There is nothing evoked from this. This is a piece of ideological propaganda, and that's what Marvel Comics was becoming. And I think people can recognize that, and I think that was why they weren't buying it.
Sure. So, as you kind of referenced already, like, even if someone said, well, you know, it's just a game or a comic, like, I mean, I agree with you. I would just say, hey, listen, mate, I care about games and comics, you know, like, I'm not just going to give that up as something frivolous. But obviously, the most worrying area where this kind of behavior and the way this is kind of seeped into society and literally affects lives is topics that are very hot button topics, like immigration. And then particularly within that, the most famous example always given is Muslim immigration and any kind of radicalization of that religion. Now,
actually, the worst. I think the worst examples are things like Rotherham.
Sure. Yes. Exactly.
I think they're actually far worse, because I mean, at least with terrorism, there's no justification for not doing anything.
Right.
You can't say, oh, you know, I was worried about being racist, so I didn't arrest the terrorist. I mean, they probably do already do that, but it's got a lot less weight. And one thing I think that it was the report by Dr. I think it was Alexa J was the name of the doctor, who she had basically done a study into an inquiry into the events of Rotherham, and found that the police and the council had been complicit in covering up rape gangs that were grooming and raping teenage girls, and they were exclusively white girls, and they were being done by exclusively Muslim Pakistani men. And the reason they were doing it is because they weren't Muslims. And the police and the authorities and everyone on the left stuck their fingers in their ears and went, la 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 la, you're a racist. It's like, that's not racist to say that. That's why they did it. And if it was a bunch of white guys, if it was like the EDL, who were grooming and raping Muslim Pakistani girls because they were Muslim Pakistani girls, you know that people would be flipping the table and saying, right, something has to be done. And I would agree, something would have to be done. But unfortunately, in this case, it's the other way around, and something still has to be done. I mean, it is, you know, many of these people have actually gone to jail now, but it took a long time for us to get to this position. And there are a lot of victims, and there are a lot of people who want to slander and smear people. I mean, I don't care what people think about Tommy Robinson. I don't really know him, but if I've spoken to him once on a live stream when I interviewed him, like with Jordan Peterson, but you can't deny that his predictions have been right. Not only that, I mean, in 2011 there was an interview with him, Jeremy Paxman, going around, where he's saying, look, there are all these grooming gangs, and these are specific problems with these communities. The Sikhs aren't doing them, the Hindus aren't doing them. It's the Muslim communities in these areas. Lo and behold, it comes out he's absolutely right, and the scale is way worse than anyone thought. Same with Muslim radicalization in jail. He's been saying for years that, I mean, I think it was 2014 or 2015 where he did a speech at the Oxford Students' Union, and he gave the speech saying, look, you're going to see a lot of Muslim radicalization coming out of jails, because basically these gangs are committing a lot of crimes. When the gang members get caught, they get sent to jail. They're radical preachers in jail, who are in jail for radical preaching, get to speak to them all day, every day, because they're in the same bloody cells. And so they just radicalize them in these jails, and lo and behold, that comes out to be true as well. And so it's not racist to say these things. If white people were doing these things, you would absolutely demand that people took action. And if someone turned around and said, yeah, but they're white, you say, I don't care. And honestly, I actually do think that it's the soft racism of low expectations when dealing with these communities. You have to hold them to the same standard you'd hold anyone else to. You know, I would hold a Chinese person to the standard I would hold an African, an Indian, anyone. And yet, for some reason, these communities have been getting a free pass. I'm sorry, but you can't do these things. It's not racist to say that. It's racist to say that they can do these things because they're somehow incapable of not doing it because they're Muslims or something. It's like, no, of course they're not. They know it's wrong. They do it because they know they can get away with it. So
this is an example of where, that's probably a better example in as much as, like, yes, radical terrorism won't really probably affect me or you literally directly, whereas yes, that absolutely one day could affect all of us on some level. So my question would be this: again, to refer back to Hitchens, another great point he's often made when he talked, funnily enough, this was before a lot of the Muslim stuff, it was when he was talking about Christianity, actually, which was that Christians now will reverse engineer the whole history of their religion as, well, no, we became more progressive, we took on a lot of liberal values. And he always makes the point that, like, no, you were essentially like a wild dog brought to heel by secular values. Like, essentially, people said to you, if you want to remain in this society, you better start doing these things. And so famous examples would be, you can say it for all day long whatever you think the tenets of Mormonism are, but you better let black people in now. Literally, they were made to themselves build this into their philosophy. So there's clearly a kind of a framework for how you can get almost any of these ideologies into a more reasonable state if it's in a Western country. But the problem is, as long as the social justice warriors push this idea that we have to go the other way, and we have to make society more in line with radical Islamic ideas, we're not going to be going in the right direction in that sense, are we?
Yeah, I think that people, and I include Muslims in this, everyone has a moral duty to resist radical Islam, in the same way they have a duty to resist radical communists and Nazis. Any totalitarian ideology that demands, and it's always the most radical variant of it that is totalitarian, or at least the most oppressive. Any of these ideologies, and that's the problem with Islam. It's at once a political ideology and a religion. And you will often find people who have been politicizing it committing crimes, and the people who are not politicizing it trying to excuse it on the grounds of religiosity. And I'm sorry, but you're going to have to secularize Islam. There is simply going to be no other way for it to operate in the Western world. While there are Muslims who think, you know what, I could politicize Islam, then we will never be free of politicized Islamic violence.
Yeah.
Especially when, imagine if the communists thought Karl Marx was a prophet of God and that a paradise awaited them when they died.
Sure.
That communist terrorism is the second most common type of terrorism in the world behind Islamic terrorism. I think that if they thought Karl Marx was a god or a prophet or something, then it would be exactly the same. It would be exactly the same set of problems, exactly the same number of casualties, basically. It would be, but yeah, basically the secularization of Islam has to happen. But the good thing is, I think it actually is happening. It's just a slow and painful process. Because Islam contains many mechanisms to prevent this. The apostasy is punishable by death. That's the best way to prevent people from leaving your religion. But I watched Tom Holland's documentary on ISIS Origins of Violence the other day. It's very good. Tom Holland's excellent, and he's one of the sort of few. Tom Holland's a historian, and he's an excellent historian. But he's also one of the few public figures who's more interested in the truth than virtue signaling, which is fantastic. We need more people like that. But yeah, so basically, the conclusion from this is that ISIS, and not just ISIS, basically the sort of Salafist school of thought in Islam, which is the real hardline, full Sharia, full Islamic State, caliphate, that sort of thing. Basically, Salafist school of thought is attempting to remove Western ideas that have crept into Islam. And Tom Holland believes that these crept in around the time of Napoleon's conquest of Egypt, because he went out there not just with an army, but he also went with a lot of culture. He went with intellectuals, academics, artisans, craftsmen, artists, and set up various institutions in Egypt that prospered because they were producing good work. And they basically brought the values of the Enlightenment to the East. And suddenly the Islamic world was having these thrust into it, whether they liked it or not. And I think at least partially to Holland's thesis on this is the idea that these Salafist and hardline Islamic movements that want to get back to, and I think Quranic literalism, it's not just the Quran that would be involved in that, the hadiths and all that, but the surahs, the sunnahs, or whatever they're called. But I think that if we just call them Quranic literalists, I think we can show basically what they are. And there is obviously a lot of bad things in the Quran, but I've read the Quran as well, and it's not pretty. And so if a feminist ever tells you that Islam is a feminist religion, they're wrong, and they don't know what they're talking about. it's not. It actually codifies a deliberate inequality between men and women. But that's just the most hardline reading of it. This is what the Salafists are seeking to return to. Normal sort of, I guess what we call moderate Muslims, probably aren't trying to do that. I mean, it's actually really ironic, the Syria situation, is that under Assad, I mean, you'll notice that Bashar al-Assad, he wears a suit, and his wife wears Western clothing, and people under his regime don't have to wear burqas. And yet under the rebels, under, say, al-Nusra or ISIS, they want a very hardline, strict Islamic state. And it doesn't look like the Syrian population wants that either. Al-Nusra are having problems holding one of the provinces on the grounds that they couldn't actually enforce Islamic law on the populace to the extent that they wanted, because they didn't have the manpower to do it. Because you need a police of vice and virtue to wander around and police everyone's actions and make sure that women are wearing their heads covered and whatnot. And sure. Yeah, it's all kinds of crazy things. But basically, this school of thought seems to think that there's been a deliberate and aggressive encroachment of Enlightenment values into Islam, and one of the reasons that they're justifying terrorism is for the purity and sanctity of Islam itself. Most Muslims don't agree with this, and we're lucky, but it's kind of inevitable as well, because it's kind of path of least resistance. If you get to be free and happy, it's just more appealing than having some guy police everything you do at the point of a bayonet or something like that. It's complicated.
Yes. So, I mean, one area in which this is concerning, again, because I'm looking at it from the perspective of, like, how can the secular society kind of police this? And as we're kind of pointing out here, I mean, in literal policing, they're not to some degree, So yeah. One way I often model it in my own brain is if you think of someone who literally comes from a fairly primitive Middle Eastern country where, I mean, admittedly, a lot of them weren't that primitive even 70 years ago. They were made by these people having free reign, essentially. They've taken it back. They do kind of run on an operating system in their brain as though they were in like the 4th century or something. And so you take that person and put them in another country, I can already see where that could go wrong, because they're going to think very differently.
Absolutely. They've just got a completely different paradigm. I mean, the Norway actually had to start... one of the things that drives a lot of people crazy in the West about feminism is when they say, well, what we need to do is teach men not to rape. Like, men don't already know this. Well, there are actually cultures where men don't know this. I mean, they literally don't have a conception of rape, legally or morally. Plus, for example, I
mean, just to give a little bit of context, one thing when I looked into this myself was it's not as irrational as it thinks. Again, if we try to think from a reasonable perspective, if in your culture you're told that all women who are under normal circumstances will be covered and they'll have a man with them, and you'll only ever meet them in these again, there's different rules. You've never been in a scenario where suddenly you're there's the girl in the miniskirt, you can talk to her, no one will. This is crazy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not just that as well. It's actually worse. It's that woman is actually in your culture signifying herself as being like a prostitute or a harlot or something. Yeah. And if that's what you've thought your whole life, and I mean, not just men either thinking this, women think this.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, women are just as culpable when it comes to enforcing these norms, because I mean, and often these are sort of power plays in and of themselves. Yeah. Because if you've put all the time and effort in to be the perfect Islamic woman, you're damn right you're not going to let someone else just usurp that by just being like, I'm not going to do anything. No, the rules are this. You've played by these rules. Yes. You're going to want everyone else to play by these rules as well. But yeah, it's. I mean, it literally is something that they don't have a conception of in many cultures. And Saudi women can't even drive. The Islamic world is so behind on women's attitudes towards women, not just women's rights, just the attitudes themselves, that it's really crazy that we could think there could be that they would just not think differently. I mean, they've got no choice but to think differently to us when it comes to, say, women, and gays as well. Another thing, oh my god, this is something that I've always considered myself quite left-wing, and I've always been completely supportive of gay rights. I've never been able to see an argument against gay people having the same rights as everyone else, because their sexuality It's not something they've chosen. It's not something that really interferes with day-to-day life, and I don't see why. There's just no good argument. I mean, the only arguments I've ever heard are religious, and that's not good enough for me because I'm an atheist. So, sorry. But that doesn't mean that the religious people don't necessarily feel that. But even then, you have something like 75% of all Muslims on earth think homosexuality is immoral, which is why there are so many Islamic countries where there are 11 with the death penalty, and I think another something like 23 or something where it's just outlawed. It's just illegal. And then you've got stories coming out of Chechnya of apparently gay concentration camps, which apparently are less fabulous than you'd imagine. I
could imagine, yeah.
It's dark humor. I've been on the internet too long. But no, literally, they apparently have been rounding up gay people and putting them in concentration camps. And it's like, God. And then you've got, in Saudi Arabia, they claim they don't have homosexuals in their country.
Yes.
It's like, yeah, that's obviously nonsense. But yeah, these values are simply not compatible with us. I mean, you can't. And Tony Blair, incidentally, was one of the people who's come out and said this. I think it was in 2015. There was an article in the Independent where he'd given them an interview, and he was basically saying, look, we actually have millions of people here who have fundamentally incompatible values. And I think that's really ironic, given that you're the one who allowed them to come.
Yes.
Tony, you opened the door. And there was a biography of Tony of Blair where it was accused that he did it because he thought these people would vote Labour. Which I don't know how true that is. Let's hope it's not true, Tony. I can't imagine what other motivation you would have had, though. But yeah, it's a real problem. And the thing is, it wouldn't be that much of a problem if it wasn't like a totalitarian worldview that was proposed in Islam. It wouldn't be a problem because, like, you've got lots of communities in Britain, but most of them don't cause too many problems, and most of them have a good degree of overlap with ethnic communities. But with Muslim communities, there is an awful lot of I don't want to say hostility because that's the wrong term, but there's an awful lot of they're very insular. And I mean, I was reading Theresa May had proposed an inquiry into the Sharia courts in Britain, because we've got more than 80 of them in Britain operating. And the worry is that women aren't getting justice from these courts under British law. They're getting justice under Sharia law, which under British law would be illegal. Yes. To give these things would, I mean, not every time, but there would be many things under Sharia law that would be illegal for under British law, and they are worried about it. And one of the main reasons they're worrying is because it's something like 22% of Muslim women in Britain don't speak English, and that should give you an impression of how insular these communities are. They can't even speak English, and I mean, the reason I think I know what the deal is here is because my dad was in the RAF, and I spent 8 years of my life living in Germany. I can't speak any German. I can't speak any German because I didn't have to. I was always on an English camp. It was basically like an English city that was, you had everything you needed. And you could go into local German cities and stuff, but it was essentially like going on holiday because everything was so bloody English in the camp. That you were just in a foreign country, and so I never had to learn German. All the people around me spoke English. All the people around me were English, and I never needed to. And I think the same thing is happening in certain areas in Britain and in Sweden. And Tim Pool is an independent journalist who recently, when Donald Trump said, "Oh, last night in Sweden," and everyone was like, "Ha ha ha, Donald, nothing happened last night in Sweden." That ignores all the previous times where things have happened because they don't talk. But he actually went over to Sweden, crowdfunded his way over, and he went to, I can't remember the name of the district in the city, but he went over to a Swedish city that was rumored to be a no-go zone for it wasn't even just white people either, it was just non-Muslim areas in these countries. Okay. And he got chased out by a gang of Muslims, and he got escorted out by the police. And it turned out that it was a no-go area. And we see these fairly regularly. I mean, we've seen you can open a copy of the Daily Mail or the Express and always see something like Muslim Sharia patrol. And they love it because it sounds horrendous. And it is horrendous, don't get me wrong. I don't want to downplay it, but it's not as widespread. I mean, like, I can't remember the American politician, but they basically, I think it was Fox News, in fact, said, it was an analyst on Fox News who said that Birmingham is a Muslim city and white people aren't allowed there. That's not true.
Sure, yeah.
That's, you know, but it is something that happens, and it's something we need to be aware of. It's something that needs to enter the national dialogue. We can't just pretend these things aren't happening. They are.
Yeah. So one aspect of this is, as alarming as it is that these things happen, and that, you know, literal policing, for example, doesn't always take care of them or in any kind of reasonable manner. One thing that's more worrying to me is, again, how the average person on the street sees it. So when I put myself in that position I described earlier, where I didn't know anything about these topics, I would have probably said very similar things to a lot of people who I would say are intelligent or reasonable. Oh, I'd say I'm generally a little bit left-leaning, maybe liberal values, you know.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why it would seem very difficult for this stuff to ever penetrate my mind is because, as you've said here, the only people who'd ever report on that would be the Daily Mail, or it'd be someone who'd do it in a way where it seems so distasteful that I would immediately be like, I'm out of this. And so one of the problems here is, when I was young, I mean, I'm 34 now, so I'm not very young, but when I was a young man growing up and I was in college and university, the go-to papers, as you can probably guess, were things like The Guardian, The Independent. If you ever go and look at the history of these papers, I actually think that it's kind of like cool, the principles they were founded on. You know, they are founded on things like the idea of not having political bias, of not allowing politics to interfere with news, etc. But obviously,
it's a long time ago now.
yeah, that's the point I'm obviously getting to, which is that if I think of the person who I would want to talk to now and say, what do you think about these things? The problem is, those papers absolutely mirror and have been riddled with exactly the sort of thinking that means they will never address these things properly. Like, the famous examples obviously are, they might write about the same thing and they would purposely leave out what race the people were, what background they're from, in a very, almost like the silence is what speaks the volumes there. Right? So how does it ever get out there if these institutions essentially have been co-opted, right?
Social media and the right-wing gutter press, unfortunately.
Okay.
I have to use the Daily Mail and the Daily Express as a source more than I am comfortable with, by a long way, because other outlets just don't investigate these things. They don't want to. I mean, I used to read The Guardian and The Independent a lot, and I still don't find The Independent to be too bad. Okay. But you can see the incremental bias that has crept into it. It's really glaring at this point. I mean, in 2015, they published an article under an anonymous author. They didn't even give you the name of the author, where the article was the case for never letting a white man hold a position in Oxford University again.
I remember this, yeah.
I was just furious. I mean, that's unacceptable for anyone to print. I mean, what's the difference between the Daily Stormer and that, when the Daily Stormer says the Jews should never be able to be bankers? Yeah. What's the difference? What is the difference? And this is the thing. It's not only is it like a functional similarity, it's a moral equivalence, in my opinion. And so, yeah, I found it. I mean, they removed it, actually. I did a video and they ended up removing it. I don't know whether it was tied to that, but it'd be nice if it was, because, God damn it, that is beyond the pale and completely unacceptable. But yeah, there has been an extremely, and I think this happens because of arguments. I think the creep to the left has been because nobody on the left has actually been resisting or really thinking very hard about the way they come to those decisions. I think people spend too much time looking at the end result and not enough on the process. Because, like, liberalism and progressivism are they're ideologies that they have similar goals, or they cover similar subjects in similar ways. No, sorry, not in similar ways. They cover similar subjects, but not in similar ways. For example, for progressives, tolerance is a virtue. For liberals, tolerance is a consequence. But liberals don't really think about it, because they think, well, tolerance is fine. I have no objection to tolerance. That is, in fact, the consequence of what I'm suggesting. Everyone will have to be tolerant of each other. Yeah. But the virtue is in allowing people to speak. The virtue is freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the protection of people's rights. if you do these things, then you will have to have tolerance at the end of it. There's simply no option. Yeah. That protects the rights of everyone involved. But for a progressive, what they want are, say, tolerance, and they don't really care about your rights. They're quite happy to censor you. They don't care. They will see censoring someone who is going against tolerance in what they consider to be tolerance, their interpretation of it. They will consider that to be a virtue. They will say it's a good thing to have shut you down, and at very least, they will try and appear bashful about it, but say, well, no, I thought that was the right thing to do. And it's because you both, there's sort of like overlap on the concept of tolerance, but you arrive there at totally different roads. And when it comes down to the choice of tolerance or freedom of speech, a liberal is going to say freedom of speech, but a progressive is going to say tolerance. And that's where they diverge. And this is where this is where the conflict between people like me and people like the SJWs comes out. And they were way more canny than we were. I mean, they got in there quick. They knew they had their pattern. They had academic backing. They knew what they were doing. And this is why the liberals, I did, it was about a year ago now, but I did an audience survey, and 75% of my audience was either sort of left-leaning or right-leaning libertarian across the center. People who essentially value free speech and freedom of expression and the freedom to explore ideas as they want. That was most of my audience, are basically disaffected lefties and people who are in the center, who were quite happy to deal with the left wing and talk to the left wing and vote left wing if it would, secure freedom of speech, which is something the left used to be all about. I mean, watching left wingers turn on Julian Assange has been heartbreaking. No, you are absolutely wrong. Julian Assange is a hero. Stop even suggesting that we should be siding with the state just because you have power. And now Trump's got it. Oh, Julian Assange is a hero again. Oh, shut up. Just shut up. No consistency. It really annoys me. But yeah, basically, liberals have to understand why they came to the conclusions that they want and the values that they have along the way, and contrast them with the actual values that progressives have. And you'll find that you don't have much in common with them at all, especially when it comes down to the rub.
So one aspect that I find really jarring whenever someone's trying to explain the concept of like patriarchy and oppression and the idea that it's systemic, they always use this term like systemic, it's instituted. Yeah. One part that really doesn't fit with that I'm amazed they can overcome this in their minds, is that when you see all these protests, okay, and you see people blowing air horns in people's ears, punching people, like doing things, sometimes everything up to violence, very, very openly harassing people.
Yeah.
You don't see those people prosecuted to the full extent of the law that in a patriarchy, presumably they would be. I mean, there was this recent incident, I'm sure you saw it online, where there was a British guy who just had a little sign that said, free speech is for everyone. And if you saw the fallout of this, right, what happened was when these people were very aggressive towards him in a way that was obviously inappropriate, the people essentially tagged in the Twitter of the Met Police. And the Met Police, rather than just say nothing, literally said something along the lines. The gist was, there was only a couple of officers there, so what could they have done to that whole crowd? And I remember just thinking, imagine if that logic was applied to every protest that, isn't culturally allowed, Like if me and you and 10 friends got now...
to the EDL rallies, do they?
No, we would all be arrested about what we're doing in this, especially if we're...
Yeah.
Blowing air horns, people say, things that actually aren't that crazy, but have a sinister element to them.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. What do you think of this? Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the one thing that really bothers me is the social justice warriors are institutionalists. They believe in the power of institutions. They believe in the authority of institutions. And therefore, they are very willing to work with and use these institutions to enhance their agenda. Even when their agenda is ostensibly meant to be say, corporatist, they will get into bed with every corporation that just spouts their propaganda that says something ideologically pleasing. And if they get it wrong, they use it as an opportunity to attack the corporation. It's so backhanded. But yeah, so I can't remember the question now.
It's about the fact that they don't get essentially prosecuted. Like they're kind of getting a free pass, even though they think they're in this nightmare totalitarian state, right?
No. Well, that's the thing. Like I said, they're institutionalists, and the reason that I think that the reason that they get a soft deal is because of connections within the institutions who ideologically favor the protesters. Okay. And I think that Berkeley is the best example of this, because we know a lot about the situation in Berkeley, and it's really obvious. The mayor of Berkeley, he's very publicly pro-social justice. He's very progressive, every single progressive talking point you can think of, he has put on his Twitter feed, and it's something very, you can see. He knows personally the leader of this woman called Yvette Falaka, who's a leader of a group called By Any Means Necessary. Nice name, isn't it? They organize these Antifa protests. They're really not entirely them, but they're instrumental in organizing these Antifa protests, where you've got black-clad communists, anarcho-communists, running around setting fire to things, beating people, intimidating people, and causing hundreds of thousands of dollars of property damage. The police were told to stand down. They must have been, because there are plenty of videos of journalists going up to cops and saying, "Excuse me, why aren't you doing anything?" And they're just like, "No, I'm not going to discuss it. We're just going to stand here and watch." And then you get like 4chan posts, and the veracity of these is completely not worth talking about. But it would, if you were a policeman and you wanted to tell people that, look, we've been told to stand down and just let them do what they're doing, where are you going to go? So you can't, you'll be heard, but you're not going to endanger your job. You're going to go to 4chan. And there have been a few of these now, and they don't sound unconvincing.
Whistleblowers then?
Well, yeah, I can't attest to the veracity of it, but it's not, if it was true, then it would certainly fill the last piece of the it'd be the last piece of the puzzle that we would need to say, right, this is definitely what's happening. At the moment, we've just got 95% of it, and we're just looking for that last piece. And so, to be honest with you, I'm absolutely certain that these people are being given permission implicitly by the establishment of Berkeley, and because of the people controlling it who hold an ideological sympathy, if not directly the same ideology, with the people protesting. They're basically on the same side. I think that's and another reason as well. And another reason these people get a leniency is because they're really middle class. They are the bourgeoisie. They are fairly well off. A bunch of people have been arrested, and there have been students and professors who have been radicalized in university to become radical socialists, and now they're LARPing as socialist revolutionaries in the streets. It's really embarrassing. And a bunch of them have been identified, and a couple of them have been professors, because they're dyed-in-the-wool ideologues, and they think that they can bring on Marxist socialist paradise. It's never going to happen. They think that they can do it, and I think they're also using it as an excuse to determine that someone else is a Nazi and, say, hit them in the head with a bike lock or something like that, because they want to. They want to do these things. They're looking for reasons to hurt people, and they find them. And I think they get a free ride a lot of the time, or at least soft, kid gloves, because they're just soft middle-class wusses. These people aren't violent. They're built like stick men. They don't know anything about violence, and so the police don't just club them down like they would if it was like a football riot or something like that. Sure. They get a lot more roughly handled, and I do think there's an element of class in there, absolutely. But there is also definitely ideological sympathies, and that's it. That's the reason I think that they get an easy ride.
Okay. So I actually have, when we talk about the topic of actual real literal gender politics, and obviously one of the most famous hot button topics there is the transgender issue, or gender spectrum, whatever they call it. I actually can bring you a new example that you probably haven't heard of, because it's very, very niche, and not a lot of people even in esports know this.
So let's see if I know.
You might like this, because when I explain it, it's going to go into a wider point that will seem a bit abstract, but it's just stick with it, okay? So within esports, last year, the BBC did an article which took kind of the typical, what you'd expect an SJW's way of pushing esports through their prism, right? Which was they looked at it and they said, right, obviously in some way women are being oppressed here, and it's got to be that that's the reason why there aren't, you know, women who are pro gamers. And so one of the things they did famously was they actually took the amount of earnings for the, like, you know, like the player, he was actually a Dota 2 player who'd won the most money ever. He'd won like, you know, 5 million.
Yeah.
And then they took what was listed as the highest paid female player ever, and she'd won something like 250,000. Okay. And they said, right, look at the disparity here. Obviously, you know, there's all these reasons that are keeping them out, etc. But here's the really interesting part about it. Okay. That actually sparked a thought in me that no one in esports had ever said. And I put it into this video I did on women in esports. And the rest of the video, okay, is very, very fair-handed, you know. I kind of make the point that, yes, obviously there aren't as many women competing and they don't have the same background. There's a lot of reasons, you know, that we can't really know if that's the reason they do or don't get them. But I'm trying to put all the reasons out there and let people take from it what they will.
Yeah.
But this sparked a thought in me, which was quite astonishing, actually, which what I realized was the person they'd listed as the woman is actually a male to female transgender individual. Now, what that made me realize, and no one had thought this in esports before, was I thought, wait a minute, that's true, actually. When I looked back in history, okay, there was maybe like 2 people I was ever aware of who were actual born women who'd had any success in gaming. And one was like 15 years ago, and that wasn't like, you know, she didn't win championships, she was just an okay player. Yeah. And another one was one where she was in more of a niche game, and she was pretty good for a while, but obviously not on the level of, like, you know, the greatest male player in any game. Now, what's weird is, what I realized was, well, they're right, you know, there weren't as many women competing, there aren't as many watching, but then I thought, wait a minute, how many transgender people can there be playing and watching the game? And what I found was, you'll like this, there are literally 3 or 4 instances of transgender people who were successful in the male aspects of the games. Now, you can probably already guess which direction the gender went on that one.
Male to female.
They were all male to female. Yeah. Now, I had to leave it there because I don't know what that really says. I mean, it's certainly startling, but here's the point, right? In that world, it's not actually a problem, okay? That's a weird conclusion, but it doesn't matter because luckily in gaming, we were never stopping women competing in male competition anyway. What happens is they can all compete, they're just not good enough, unfortunately, to qualify, and then they have their own tournaments that are specifically women only. And actually, by the way, that's obviously sexism, but it's not a big deal. It's purely a marketing thing. And so we leave that, okay? My point is this, though. Take that same principle and go into the world of traditional sports. And in traditional sports, thanks to the work of people like Serena Williams, etc., there are now women's sports where they get as much money as men do, and they have potentially the celebrity and success as some of these men. Well, I'm sure you've seen, this is where I'm going to tie in that contrast, okay? I'm sure you've seen the stories over the last few years where because of gender politics, they now have to allow male to female transgender people to take part in certain sports that only women competed in. So I have a theory, Sargon, that if this happened on such a small sample size in gaming, where, you know, like twice as many from about 100th as many people competing exceeded, if one day there are enough people who identify in this way and are allowed to compete, I actually think that will subjugate women in sports because it will be dominated by potentially men who identify as women. What do you think of this?
It's inevitable, actually. The problem, like, I don't know about esports, but I certainly know that for regular sports, men are just physically better at most sports than women. They've got they tend to have like faster reaction times, greater muscle density, upper body strength, running speed, swimming speed, all of this sort of thing. Men are just physically more capable than women on average. Sure. So, and then the end, men's records are always higher than women's records. Yes. It's not a point of bias or prejudice. This is just what the data shows us. This is. Yeah, and we can identify the physical reason for it as well. Sure, yeah. We can scientifically, biologically find the exact reasons, and then you get women's MMA is an interesting subject because I don't follow women's MMA, and someone hosted a video on my channel, but they
I know a little bit, so I can probably fill in any blanks.
I can't remember the name of the women involved. Yes. But basically, this female MMA champion had to fight a male to female transgender, and even though she beat her, she was like, wow, I've never actually been the recipient of force like that. Right. Okay. And this male to female transgender person who's now competing as a woman she's like broken the eye sockets of various other women and stuff like this, other female competitors. It's obvious to anyone who is just watching that I don't have a scientific study to prove it, but I'm pretty certain that if they did a scientific study, they would find that it was the fact that she was born a man and had a man's body growth and development into adulthood and then transitioned that gives her a natural advantage over these other women. Yeah. It's just the biological reality of it, I think, is the problem. I mean, one of the things that feminists often complain about is the gender segregation in sports.
Yes.
If they got rid of that, you would basically be getting rid of women in sports. Because
yes, for sure.
You would just have teams of men, because the women, I mean, you would have occasionally, every now and again, you'd have a woman who makes the grade, but most of the time it's just the biological reality of it that
I mean, we've literally, seen examples of this. I mean, a famous one was, I think it was it was either the Australian or the USA women's soccer team, who at the time were like number one, and then they lost to like a high school male team.
15-year-old Australian.
There's a bunch of examples. I mean, it's funny I bring up Serena Williams. There's a famous example with her where she lost to some she was in her prime and she lost to someone who was like, a teenage, like an 18-year-old boy who like smoked at the half of the. It was almost like the way it was written. You almost thought, is this like The Onion or something like? Yeah. This is ridiculous how extreme it is. But yeah, the cases are out there. So my point in that area is, again, listen, we can put sports with comics in that sense. It's not the end of the world if women can't win money in sports, but it's kind of a dark future you see us going towards if we let these things go to the nth degree.
Well, I think that gender segregation in sports is inevitable, because otherwise you won't have women's sports. It's just gonna be life. It's just in the same with the Paralympics. I mean, I guess regular sports are open to disabled people, but they generally don't do them because they can't meet the grade. The able-bodied people are just more capable physically. It's not a moral judgment. It's just the fact of the matter. And
well, I mean, that to be crass, that would obviously be the ultimate analogy, wouldn't it? It'd be if someone who was just able-bodied said, well, I actually have always identified as disabled, and then they just won the 100 meters, over
I mean,
wheelchairs.
I'm 5'9". That's not tall. That's totally average. And so, I could go down to a basketball court everywhere. I could apply for everything. I could train for 10 years, but I'm never going to dunk. And it's just the fact that I'm not 6'4", and that's never going to change. And so I have to, I mean, don't get me wrong, if they say, okay, we'll have between 5 and 6 foot basketball league and then above 6 foot basketball league, I'd say fine. I'll go down and play in the 5 to 6 foot one because I'm just not 6 foot above. It's just life. Unfortunately, there are physical restrictions we simply can't get around. And it's unfair to handicap players because some other people just can't manage. If all men had to play tennis with big heavy bracelets on or something to slow them down so the women players could keep up, I mean, that's ridiculous. That's coming into sci-fi parody territory. It's just going to be, I mean, it's ideologically inconvenient for social justice because there are many people who believe that people listening, you will find it hard to believe that there are literally thousands of people, including professors, who think that there are no biological differences between men and women, and that there are simply no physical differences. And it's just like, well, these people are insane, and yet they get paid by the, say, American and British governments, taxpayers. And these people are ideologues, and they're full of shit, and they've taken an interpretation they wanted to hear rather than the one they should have actually taken based on reality, and you're never going to persuade them otherwise.
So earlier, I noticed when you said about why you don't like the term cultural Marxism, is because it at least has like a stigma where, yes, is the sort of thing that might be thrown around by someone in kind of a conspiracy screed. It's a term that would be thrown in there. I mean, another famous one, obviously, that is, it's so muddied at this point, is the term globalist. If you hear that from someone, then you well could be within the realm of someone.
Alex Jones, yeah.
So my question for you is this. I remember, as someone who spent a lot of time on the internet and on forums, because again, coming from the computer gaming world, right? In theory, yes, I do ignore a lot of stupid comments, but sometimes if something seems like very different to how I think, but it's well written and it's argued, at least in my own brain, even if I end up dismissing it, I at least consider it, right? One thing that really changed my perspective on that was when I found out all that stuff about Correct the Record with Hillary, that essentially some of these people are just paid trolls. Now, within that realm, okay, this is my problem with some of the social justice warrior stuff. If it was just independent people, to whatever degree you can be independent if you choose to be part of a group, who were all acting literally off what they believed, that's one thing, because, maybe you can talk with those people, you can dialogue. I mean, we know you can't, but because they literally don't allow dialogue and platforming, but in my ideal world. But the problem is, there does seem to be some vague connections to what you could call globalist agenda, or whatever people would say in that sense. People funding these kind of things.
These people but
I notice though that you're very careful about this. Like sometimes you will address these things, but other times you can be quite dismissal of things. I mean, the idea that, for example, George Soros was funding some of these things. So what can you say about that? To what extent is there conspiracy involved in this, do you think?
Okay, I wouldn't use the term conspiracy, because I don't think we need to use the term conspiracy. Okay. I think it's more realistic to look at it as just people pursuing their own interests. For example, the people who adopt social justice are always very pro-immigrant, pro-open borders. They're pro-globalism, and it's not a conspiracy to them. That's just their opinion. They don't like borders. They don't like nationalism. They would much rather see free movement of people all across the globe at all times. And I think that's an unsustainable proposition. I think the world is not nearly utopian enough to allow that to work and not ruin the world. I mean, everywhere would basically have to be on the same economic level, so there wasn't an economic incentive to move from the poor third world into the first world. And moving into the first world, there are studies that show, one was done by the Bank of England recently, that mass immigration of poor people, it just hurts the poor people in that country because it depresses wages. Yeah. And that's not even talking about the social problems that come along with it, as we were talking about earlier. Yes. Economically it attacks them as well. It's effectively a form of class warfare, because the only people that benefit from this are people who are at the top of the pyramid, who benefit from having a large pool of ready labor. Because in Britain at any one time, we've got about 1.3 million free jobs. We've got 1.3 million unemployed, but around 700,000 free jobs.
Okay.
We can't possibly have full employment. It just couldn't happen, because we've got a far greater labor supply than we do actual job supply. Just market forces mean that the price of labor is going to go down under that. It's just inevitable. You can't do anything about that. That's the law of supply and demand. So I don't see who they think is benefiting, but you'll notice that the people who always advocate for this are people who are saying, they're not saying let in millions of Middle Eastern journalists, are they? They're not saying let in millions of Middle Eastern professors. They're saying let in millions of Middle Eastern workers, and they are people who are not in competition. These people are not going to end up writing for The Guardian. These people are going to end up on a factory line somewhere, or in the job centre or something like that, competing with regular people who don't have the option of, say, moving or something like that. It's actually, I know they don't mean to be bad. They're thinking, but if we just let them in, we've got it good, and they'll have it good too. But that's just wishful thinking. It won't continue to be good. And it won't be good for the people who you have no contact with. Because another thing, the problem we have is that people on the left seem to live in some sort of middle-class bubble where they do not understand the concerns of the working class. And this is what, Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto is the prime example of this. The Labour Party are at 34% in the polls now, which is the highest they've ever been. But the Conservative parties like Lead, they've been on 49% or around there for months. They haven't changed. People, since the Brexit vote, people know what they're voting for, and they're voting for Brexit. The people who are joining Labour are being siphoned off from the Liberal Democrats. People who are very ideologically similar, just a slightly different party. But they're being converted around because of the cult of Jeremy Corbyn, I guess. But they're not speaking to people outside of their bubble. These are all people who are, middle class. They've all got a degree. They've been to university. They've got a degree in whatever, and they think, and they're doing quite well. They're on, about 40, 50,000 a year, something like that, or probably a bit lower, to be fair. And they think of themselves as morally upright, and they are pro-immigration, because when they look around, they're looking around at a middle-class neighborhood. They're not looking around at a working and lower-class neighborhood in, say, Rotherham, where the immigrants tend to go, places like that, the north of England. They're just not in contact with the problems, and they can just, anyone like Tommy Robinson who pokes their head up and says, hey, we've got problems in these working class communities, and they say, no, you're a racist, actually. How awful is that? Just dismiss you. No, in fact, I've decided you hate them instead. But yeah, so
okay. Yeah. So here's the thing, okay, I wouldn't pretend to be an expert about politics, even British politics, because as I said, it's not something I've put a lot of effort into. But let me give you a very naive principle, okay, here, and you tell me what you think of it. So from what you were saying there, and even the thing you said that Tony Blair revealed, that perhaps part of the reason he was in favour of letting these people in is if they would vote his way. So essentially an element of self-interest, was behind it.
Absolutely, yeah.
What if someone said, okay, let's take a macro view. If you're someone who is at the top of industry, you're at the top of business, and you have this infrastructure beneath you, and you wanted to get workers who will work for the minimum wage, then a way you could do it is you mass import people who can only do very basic jobs. And then essentially, if you were, I don't know if they actively think this way, but if you were really harsh, you'd even be thinking, good, let's not have even the poor people here who want, some competition and a little bit higher wage. Let's get the rock bottom we can. If you then have the money to lobby politicians and to put influence on them so that in any way they open the floodgates a little, or they put in place anything that gets you along the line there, is this going on, do you think?
I think that we're not ascribing a charitable intention to the people we're talking about if we take that line of it. It's not that there aren't people who do that. I just don't know how many of them there are and how cognizant they are of it. That's the thing. Because I think...
You think there's a good intention for doing it?
Absolutely. They absolutely have a good intention. I think that if you look at it in terms of interest, then you can kind of see why they do what they do. For example, like if I was a rich capitalist and I owned a vast plantation of factories or something, I don't know, just I had loads and loads of factories, and I needed millions of workers to staff these factories, I could cynically sit there and think, well, yeah, if I just bring over loads of working class people from Bangladesh and India and wherever, it's not going to be a problem for me because I live in a gated community. But I'll have all these extra workers. They'll work for minimum wage or maybe sub-minimum wage. If I can get away with it, they could think that, and that would be something to do. But I can't imagine the people actually controlling these industries are actually evil. I think that they think of themselves as good people. I mean, if you listen to, it's really interesting listening to, say, someone like Milton Friedman explain. Yes. Why capitalism is a moral good, and then you're looking at these sweatshops in Asia and you're thinking, okay, well, it's obviously not working as intended. In the same way that you can listen to any socialist professor tell you what how much of a moral good socialism is, and then you look at Venezuela or the Soviet Union or wherever, and Cuba, and the list goes on of bad outcomes on that side as well. And both people think they're operating from a position of moral rectitude. They think that this is good for everyone, or at least the majority of people, the most good. The problem is that normally, if you were saying, say, let's bring in loads of people from France. Let's say we'll bring in loads of low-wage French people, and they can come in and fill these factories up. A well-meaning capitalist would turn around and say, well, okay, why would I do that? That's bad for my own workers. Okay, yeah, I'd fill my pockets, but I would feel bad about that. But if they have a rationalization around that, for example, if it wasn't France, it was Bangladesh or somewhere else that was poor, maybe like Sudan or something, war-torn, then they could serve their self-interest of saying it's good for me to have lots of workers, by also saying, but it's a moral thing I'm doing for these people because they're in such a war-torn hellhole. So if I bring them here, the damage to the workers that are already here is small. It's extra competition. It's not, they're not being forced out of their homes or anything, but it's increased pressure through market competition. And in the meantime, I'll have done a morally good thing for a bunch of people who needed help. And so it's easy to rationalize yourself past the problems of bringing these people in. Because if they were French, you wouldn't be able to make that argument at all. So you'd be sat there going, no, I can't do that. That's beyond, But you would have a reason to do it. I think that's what's going on in their heads, or at least something similar. I don't think they think about the damage they do because they're fixated far too much on the good that they think they're doing. And I'm sure that to people in Somalia or something, being able to come over to the UK or wherever and work in factories there, that's from their perspective, I'm sure that's a damn good thing. But it's also bad for other people who didn't do anything to deserve to have bad things happen to them. And so it comes back to the train analogy. The push the fat guy over the bridge. It comes back to that. I don't think you should push the fat guy. In this case, the British working class are the fat guy. And I don't think that you deserve to get pushed over the bridge to save sort of 5 Somalis. I'm sorry, you didn't do anything. You didn't do anything wrong, so why should you deserve it?
So just as when I was talking about how clearly if a reasonable person who was of this social justice warrior philosophy, if I said to them, you can't really live in a patriarchy if you can do X, Y, Z, and in fact you get a lighter punishment, in a similar sense, as much as when things are terrible and when things are institutionalized and there's all these problems, you can't be like, well, we live in we're already in a totalitarian state, I mean, the very fact that we can have these discussions and we can have a YouTube channel and they don't shut us down tomorrow, it's pretty clear in East Germany, that's all they'd do. They'd come and cut us off. We wouldn't have access.
If you
wouldn't
wouldn't
be able to do any of these things.
Yeah.
But with that said, there is obviously pushback on either side. So one thing I know you yourself have had issues with is stuff like whether they're obviously on a wider scale, the demonetization of YouTube, people trying to attack the advertisers. On a very smaller scale, people DMCA requesting, people really pushing the limits of what is considered fair use. All this. How much of a concern is this for you? Like, how has it impacted you?
Well, it's a big concern. It's really heavily impacted me. I make my living through YouTube. So when the Wall Street Journal and the mainstream media goes after YouTube's advertisers, because YouTube is a direct competitor to these, the internet in general is a direct competitor, and YouTube is one of the biggest websites in the world. It gets something like 5 billion unique hits a month or something. It's huge. Not unique, sorry, just 5 billion total hits a month. But that's enormous. That's absolutely enormous. It dwarfs other platforms, and it dwarfs the mainstream media. And they are looking at the size of channels like mine and various other people in sort of alternative media. And I think they're getting worried. And I think that this was certainly part of a pushback against that, to try and intimidate people. But I mean, this attack on YouTube, apparently, for anyone who isn't aware, basically YouTube's monetization policies now, normally these are pretty strict as well. Yeah. So YouTube uses algorithms to basically pass through all of its videos and find something that might be offensive, like a Holocaust denial or something like that, and demonetize on the basis that Holocaust denial is something we've agreed that's okay. They might be able to say it, but YouTube isn't going to try and encourage that by financially incentivizing it. And I mean, I actually don't really like that personally. I think just let them do what they're going to do and give them the same rules. And I don't think they're going to persuade people, because if at any point you start victimizing these people, then you make them the underdog. And I think that people generally have a soft spot for the underdog. No matter how vile the underdog is, there is always a part of you that's like, well, I wouldn't want that to be me. I wouldn't want to be the one who is constantly getting persecuted because of my beliefs. And I don't see any need to persecute me over my beliefs, because I think they're completely normal. But one day they won't be completely normal, especially if we let social justice carry on as it is. And they will persecute us for a belief in free speech. They will persecute you if you think there are actually only 2 genders. They will persecute you if you think that, and they do this to each other all the time. You see it on social media constantly, where it's just lynch mobs of them dragging each other across social media. Like, what was, there was one that came out today, just like, The Daily Show was transphobic or something. Trevor Noah is a sexist. Oh my God. Oh, he is as left-wing as you can imagine, and he's getting chewed out by these people. And they will not stop until he apologizes. And it's like, God, he can't even have his opinion now. And these people will infringe on it if we don't push back. And I mean, I don't mind the Holocaust deniers being demonetized, because, I mean, we have physical proof the Holocaust happened. Why would you even do this? But by the same token, I think they should have the right to do it if they want.
Okay, let me just ask you something about that, though, because I know, by the way, I don't want to go down that whole rabbit hole.
No, they're wrong. They're just wrong.
But I will ask you this, though. That's actually an area in which, I don't know if you've ever looked into this, in which that was one of the first kind of vanguards that social justice warrior type thinking took, which is, I don't know if you're aware of this, but they don't consider someone who says there's no Holocaust. That isn't where Holocaust denier begins. They literally say, if you just say, for example, it was 5,999,000. No joke. They will literally say that means you denied it, because it's literally kind of ingrained. It is a religion in a way. Like, it's put in a way where you can't. The whole point is, obviously in some countries you can't talk about it. Yeah. And so I agree with you. I obviously find it very distasteful when people are like, none of it happened, and then they spin it into some wild conspiracy. But I would say in this area, in a weird way, some of those people who aren't ridiculous, they're almost people who. Everyone's doing that to them, They can't even address those topics. They can't have books published. Yeah. They really are. If that's kind of the future of what would happen to someone like you if all these leftists took over all of society, I feel.
Yeah, let's be honest, they are being oppressed. There's no getting around it. They're being discriminated against based on their ideology. And the thing is, there's a whole larger conversation to be had. I mean, do you think you can choose your beliefs? Because if you can't choose your beliefs, now these people are being unfairly discriminated against because they didn't even get to choose what they believe. Now, I don't want to start making people sympathetic to Holocaust denial.
Sure, yeah.
But we've got to be realistic about what we are actually doing. I mean, these people are being persecuted for their beliefs, even though I'm not even saying it's unjust. It might be completely just to do it, but just be aware that that's what's happening to them. Yeah. And the more you shut them out and ignore them, the more that their arguments are going unaddressed. And so, little by little, their numbers have been gaining because nobody's refuting what they're saying. The mainstream media, no platforming is something they do in almost every British university, and it was initially brought in against neo-Nazis and stuff like that. I'm just finding that baffling. That's so self-defeating. No, let them hear the neo-Nazi speak. The neo-Nazi will say something that's counter to fact, to reality, and then people will laugh at them for it. Or they'll boo them for being tremendous bigots or something. But let them speak, because then people need to know what they don't agree with. If you don't know what you don't agree with, you can't even know your own positions. So, let them speak. Let them say something stupid. I mean, a 95-year-old guard from Auschwitz recently went to prison in Germany for his participation in the Holocaust in Auschwitz. And he was like, yeah, I was there. This is what we were doing. Well, the people, some of them are still alive, barely. It's ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. And let them speak. The evidence is there. It's not like the evidence doesn't exist. There's no need to criminalize things people say, in my opinion. That's the thing. Opinions people hold shouldn't be criminalized.
So I know myself from having a YouTube channel. I've tried many times, as someone who's not an expert in legalese, to read through the fair use rules and what they are. And here's the thing: they're not hard and fast rules. So as a result, it's very difficult to understand. And it seems like every instance, it is like a legal matter. It's judged on its own merits, and you never know which way they're going to go. You're someone who uses a lot of material in your videos, and famously, you'll use it of people who actively are hostile to you, and thus may take recourse to try and say it's not fair use. Do you have is there a sense that you can have for what you can get away with? Are they reasonable at YouTube if you come up and you say, well, I used it in this way? Can you give some basic guidelines?
Yeah, okay. We're actually really lucky with YouTube. They are legitimately concerned about free speech, I think, and they are generally very fair. Now, that's not saying every case they're fair or anything like that, but if you have a reasonable voice and you aren't promoting hatred or things like this, there's no reason to think that you won't be left alone. I get demonetizations based on subject matter all the time, but that's because of the subject matter rather than my opinion on it. And if I get a copyright strike or a claim, I'll contest it because I make sure I use the clips within the bounds of fair use law in the UK and the US. And YouTube will 9 out of 10 times come down on my side. Because I used it honestly, and I was the reason, the whole point of these laws is so people don't just simply rip off wholesale someone else's content and throw it somewhere else. And flagging that is completely fair because that's what they're doing. But using a clip for educational purposes to allow someone to present their argument basically, and then so you can then address what they've said in some way. That's completely within the bounds of the law, and YouTube usually comes down on your side on that. Okay. So usually it's pretty good. But I know that there are some communities and some, I don't think groups, but individuals, I suppose, that they often fall afoul of YouTube for various reasons. And then, like you say, YouTube's policies, they're really vague, and they can be, I think they could be interpreted quite differently depending on the person. And I honestly think that maybe a lot of it is to do with the people at YouTube who are basically judging by intent. If you seem to be intentionally malicious, then I can imagine them interpreting their rules in a way that is to your detriment. And if you're doing something, essentially what could be the same thing, but you're obviously not doing it with malice, I can see them interpreting it in a way that's not detrimental to you.
Okay.
And I can see them doing that deliberately, and I don't think there's anything we can do about that. So basically try and be an honest actor, and I think you'll probably be okay. And that's basically how I've got where I am now. I've just tried to be an honest actor and not acted with malice.
Yeah.
And so I've been left alone. Generally, I've not had a problem, and I would put it down to that, and because I can't see any other reason for it. They censor people sometimes that I don't think they should censor, and I don't think they should censor anyone, but I at least can see the rationale from their perspective. Yeah. But saying that, the Google recently were called up by the UK government to answer for why they wouldn't take down a Holocaust denial video. And the representative said that, look, we've been having very principled conversations about this, and we refuse to take it down because we don't think we should. And that was really indicative to me, because the last thing that Google wants is governments calling up the representatives and getting Google basically in the courtroom and saying, look, we're going to start making laws if you don't start doing what we say. And yet Google said no anyway. So I think that was quite indicative. So it's not all doom and gloom, but being vocal about your objections to what's happening is essential, because if nobody objects, then they don't know that anyone cares. If you don't speak up, then nobody knows you exist, and people just assume that you give your consent to anything that's happening. So, and you can speak up in any way, just a Twitter post, a comment, sharing a video, sharing anything, just you can do something that is political, that will make your voice heard. The number of shares on something is something that gets the media's attention. If something's got like 1,000 shares, the media will start paying attention to that tweet and feature it in articles. And I'm not even joking. They genuinely spend a lot. I was arguing with a journalist the other day on Twitter, and I basically had written an article around a tweet, and he was saying, well, it's a growth industry. I was like, it is actually, isn't it? It hadn't occurred to me. But he's right. So if you look, so many articles these days either feature or are written around what, say, Donald Trump said on Twitter. It's like, okay, well, I guess this is the new reality.
Yeah. So, okay, kind of a final topic I wanted to ask about YouTube was, aside from scenarios like we've described where potentially real world implications could affect advertising revenue, etc. Taking that aside and looking at how things have gone so far with YouTube, and obviously you're someone who supports yourself also with Patreon, and people who want to support your work can go there, and that's obviously very good in as much as it bypasses amount of hits and things like this, and allows you to just do the things you want to do. I mean, that's the whole point of patronage, basically. That's why it's a great concept. Is this something where in the future, will you just still be doing this? Will it be Sargon of Akkad? Will it be these sorts of videos? Would you like one day to do something broader? Have you the Sargon network? Will there be books? What is the plan?
I might write a book at some point. I mean, I've got about 20,000 words of a book written, but at the moment there's still too much to learn, I guess is the best way to put it. So I don't want to do it yet. I'll probably end up writing a book just because I think that there's a lot that I think a lot of people could get a lot out of knowing from what I've been doing. I'm sure it'll help people. But no, I don't want the Sargon network or anything like that. Ultimately, I'm looking forward to retiring. I can't wait. There's a reason that I'm not even 40, and I've got the world's whitest beard at the front. It's stressful. It's really stressful doing this. Especially, it wouldn't be stressful at all if I was operating in bad faith. It would be easy as anything. Because I would just be looking at everyone cynically, and I would be playing the game of power politics. And so I wouldn't care about intellectual honesty as much. I just wouldn't care. And that's, I think, what a lot of these activists are doing. They're just playing the game. They don't really care. And so that's why they seem to do things that seem awful with such glee sometimes. But I think I'd like to resign at some point and retire and make video games. Actually, the reason I got into this is because I was making a video game, and basically I ended up getting into an argument on a Facebook group for indie devs from a guy called Rami Ismail from Vlambeer, and he got into an argument with me over identity politics on this video game.
Didn't know what he was starting, did he?
Yeah, he didn't. I did. He didn't. But basically, he'd kind of pulled rank on me, and then said, because I was a nobody, obviously. Yeah. I was just struggling to develop. I was part of a couple of mates. We were just struggling to develop our first game, and I basically got into this huge thing, and then my mate figured out who he was. He checked out who he was. He was like, God, are you stupid? This guy's got hundreds of thousands of followers or whatever, and he's a millionaire in this game studio. And I was like, I don't care. I just don't care. He's wrong. And then I kind of I started paying attention to the sort of the encroachment of social justice into gaming, and then Gamergate happened. I mean, it wasn't just social justice into gaming either. I'd seen I'd seen plenty of feminist stuff around, and plenty of. I mean, Black Lives Matter didn't happen at that time, but or at least it wasn't big. But yeah, loads of like feminist encroachment. And I mean, the first video I ever did was about Anise Sarkeesian, and I listened to it a while ago, and I was talking to her like she was like an idiot or something, because she just. I thought that she just surely didn't understand. But no, we now know that it was always about social justice and not about gaming.
No, that's the funny thing, isn't it? That a lot of us who have initially encountered that actually thought, again, it was a person acting in good faith who really thought these things, and we were like, no, you don't understand the games. And then later on you realise, you knew this was the score from day one, Yeah.
That interview with, what was it? It wasn't BuzzFeed, it was something like Upworthy or something like that. One of those clickbait things, but where she just comes out and says, oh yeah, it's always been about feminism and social justice and not about gaming. It's like, oh, so you are a con artist. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for saying it. It makes my job a lot easier. But yeah, that's basically how I got into this, because I was trying to do something. I would love to, when this is all blown over, I would love to go back to make my crappy games.
Okay. Right, at the end of the interview, do you have a final message, or do you want to thank anyone or say hello to anyone? Thanks to everyone who listened. And if these people worry you, then don't worry. They worry a lot of other people. There are things you can do, and they don't cost any money, but they do involve you having to talk to people who are going to call you names, but you have to do it. Otherwise, these people will be the only people around. And when people are the public opinion is being formed by random, because I mean, if you look at like any article or video or anything like that, like if I put a video up, I get like, I don't know, like 150,000 views in the first day or something, and I'll have like, I don't know, like 8,000 upvotes. The 8,000 upvotes are they're the people who are invested and engaged. They're the people who are genuinely, they want to see they want to push back against other content by showing their support for it. Yeah. The other sort of like 100,000 people, whoever doesn't, including the commenters as well, the people who don't interact with the video but just watch, they are people who want to know what's in the video, obviously, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily fighting on the same, or they're not necessarily fighting the sort of culture war. They're not trying to push back actively. If you want to be active, just comment and like. That is genuinely, share, comment, like, and then argue with an SJW on Twitter. That's basically how to fight a culture war. I mean, you obviously you can buy shirts and Patreons and whatnot, but you don't have to spend any money. But time is important, and knowing your own arguments is important, but knowing theirs is also important, so you can accurately address them. Because if you are accidentally strawmanning someone, then you'll never change their mind. You have to beat them on their own terms. So if you're talking about feminism and social justice, don't talk morality with them. They won't understand you because they don't hold the same moral paradigm as you. You have to talk about the physical effects, the material effects of the things that they're talking about. So if you're talking to, say, a socialist, point out that socialism makes everyone poor. It doesn't enrich the poor. It makes everyone poor. So, use that as your argument against them, because that's their argument is that, well, the poor are poor. So, okay, but you're going to make everyone the poor. So that, you can't go down that road. We have to choose a different path to bring the poor out of poverty. Same with feminism and politics. Like in Britain, Labour
have diversity quotas. They have feminist caucuses within the Labour Party. The Conservatives don't have anything like that, and they've had 2 female prime ministers now. So it show them on efficacy of what they're trying to achieve. That's often one of the best ways to address anything like this. Beat them on their own terms. Don't try and enforce your terms on them, because they won't accept them. They'll just reject them.